She stood at his doorway with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a truth that had ended every chance at love before. I can't have children. Most men would have turned her away. But Wyatt Boone, weathered cowboy, widowed father of 4 wild souls, just smiled through the dust and heartache. Good, he said, voice rough as prairie wind. I've got enough kids for both of us. What happened next would shake the Wyoming territory, test every law of family and blood, and prove that sometimes the fiercest love grows in the most barren soil. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels across the world. The June heat of 1886 pressed down on Wyoming territory like God's own hand, heavy and merciless, turning the Bennett Valley into a furnace of shimmering dust and dying grass. The stagecoach that rattled through that desolate landscape carried only 2 passengers, a whiskey drummer sleeping off last night's sins, and a woman who'd learned long ago that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Eleanor Pike sat with her spine straight, hands folded over a leather carpet bag that held everything she owned: 3 dresses, a book of Emerson's essays, a hairbrush with missing bristles, and 1 small wooden box she never opened. She was 28 years old, which in 1886 might as well have been ancient for an unmarried woman, though the gray threading through her auburn hair and the lines around her green eyes made her look older. Not from age, but from the particular weariness that comes from burying too many dreams before their time. The landscape outside her window was unforgiving, endless sage and scrub, punctuated by the occasional cluster of cottonwoods marking where water might be found. In the distance, the mountains rose blue and implacable, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. Eleanor had seen mountains before, in Pennsylvania where she'd been born, but these western ranges had a different quality, less majesty, more warning. They seemed to say, "We don't care if you live or die out here." She'd been on the road for 17 days, ever since the letter had arrived at the boarding house in Denver, where she'd been teaching basic letters to miners' children for room and board. The letter had been brief, written in a surprisingly elegant hand. Mrs. Eleanor Pike, I am in need of a school teacher for my 4 children, ages 4-11. The position includes room, board, and $15 monthly. No prior experience required, only patience and a firm hand. The ranch is remote. Town is 7 miles. If you can read this letter and still want to come, you're the right sort of stubborn. Wyatt Boone Bennett. Valley, Wyoming Territory. The letter had arrived on the same day her landlady informed her the boarding house was closing. The mine had played out, and the town was dying. Eleanor had read that letter 3 times, packed her bag, and bought a ticket west before her courage could fail. She'd learned not to ask too many questions about new beginnings. Every time she'd ask questions, the answers had closed doors. The stagecoach lurched over a particularly vicious rut, and the whiskey drummer jerked awake with a snort. He squinted at Eleanor through bloodshot eyes, taking in her worn but respectable traveling dress, the careful way she held herself apart from the dusty upholstery. "You headed to Clearwater?" he asked, his voice graveled with drink and tobacco. "Bennett Valley," Eleanor replied, her voice cool and polite, the voice of a woman who'd learned to discourage familiarity. The drummer's eyebrows rose. "Bennett Valley? Ain't nothing out there but the Boone place. You got business with Wyatt?" Eleanor kept her gaze on the window. "I'm to be the children's teacher." The drummer let out a low whistle. "Well, hell, pardon my language, ma'am, but those kids, they've run off 3 teachers in 2 years, little savages, the lot of them. No offense to Wyatt, but he's been raising them wild since their mama—" He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize he'd said too much. Eleanor turned to look at him directly. "Since their mother what?" The drummer shifted uncomfortably. "Died. 3 years back, fever took her, but that ain't the strangest part of the situation." He leaned forward, his breath sour. "None of those kids are actually his, He just collected them. Orphans from the wagon trains, unwanted babies, children whose folks died, or disappeared. He just took them in like stray cats. Now the county's starting to ask questions about whether he's fit to keep them, seeing as how he's got no legal claim and no wife to help raise them proper." Eleanor absorbed this information in silence. The letter hadn't mentioned any of this. Not the dead wife, not the county's concerns, and certainly not the fact that the children weren't Wyatt Boone's by blood. She should have felt deceived, perhaps even alarmed. Instead, she felt a strange kinship with a man she'd never met, a man who apparently built his family from the broken pieces the world had discarded. "How much further?" she asked. "Another hour, maybe 2. Driver's supposed to drop you at the crossroads. The ranch is about a mile up the valley from there." The drummer settled back into his seat. "You seem like a sensible woman. My advice? Take one look at the situation and get back on the next stage to Clearwater. That ranch ain't no place for a lady on her own." Eleanor almost smiled. If there was one thing she'd learned in 28 years of living, it was that she'd never been the kind of lady people made places for. She'd always had to carve out her own. The stagecoach finally shuddered to a stop at a crossroads marked by a weathered wooden sign. One arrow pointed toward Clearwater, 7 miles of civilization, however rough. The other pointed toward Bennett Valley, toward a name she'd memorized, Boone Ranch. The driver climbed down and retrieved her bag with brisk efficiency. "You sure about this, ma'am? I can take you on to Clearwater, no extra charge." "I'm sure," Eleanor said, accepting his hand as she descended. The ground beneath her feet was hard-packed earth, baked solid by the relentless sun. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else. Water, perhaps, or the promise of it. "Good luck, then," the driver said, though his tone suggested she'd need considerably more than luck. The stagecoach rattled away, leaving her alone at the crossroads with her carpet bag and her determination. Eleanor stood for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. It was so quiet out here that she could hear the wind moving through the grass, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. In Denver, there'd always been noise, the clatter of wagons, the shouts of men, the constant backdrop of a city trying to convince itself it was more than just another temporary camp. This silence was different. It demanded something from you. It asked, "What are you made of?" She picked up her bag and started walking. The road to the ranch was barely more than a pair of wagon ruts winding through the valley floor. On either side, the land rolled out in gentle waves of gold and green, broken by dark outcroppings of rock and the occasional twisted juniper. In the distance, Eleanor could see a ribbon of cottonwoods marking what must be the creek the valley was named for. And beyond that, smoke rising thin and gray against the blue sky, the first sign of human habitation she'd seen since leaving the crossroads. She walked with the sun beating down on her bonnet, the dust rising with each step and settling on the hem of her skirt. Her feet hurt. She'd been traveling in the same boots for weeks, and they'd worn thin in places. But she'd learned long ago to ignore discomfort. Pain was just information, nothing more. As she drew closer, the ranch began to take shape. It wasn't much. A low house built of rough-cut logs with a stone chimney at one end, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a corral with a few horses drowsing in the shade, and a scattering of outbuildings in various states of repair. Laundry hung on a line strung between 2 posts, flapping in the breeze. Small clothes, she noticed, and men's shirts, but nothing that looked like a woman's dress. Eleanor paused at the gate, suddenly aware of how she must look after 17 days of travel, dusty, worn, decidedly uninviting. She set down her bag, removed her bonnet, and tried to smooth her hair into some semblance of order. It was a futile gesture, but habits mattered. They were the scaffolding that held a person upright when everything else collapsed. Before she could decide whether to open the gate or call out, a child appeared from behind the barn. A boy of perhaps 10 or 11, all knobby knees and elbows, with dark hair that looked like it had been cut with a knife and an expression of deep suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, making no move to come closer. "Eleanor Pike," she replied calmly. "I'm here to see Mr. Boone. I'm to be your teacher." The boy's eyes widened, then narrowed. "We don't need a teacher." "Perhaps not," Eleanor agreed. "But Mr. Boone seems to think otherwise, and it's his ranch." "It's our ranch, too," the boy shot back. "All of us, not just his." Eleanor found herself oddly charmed by this fierce territorial claim. "You're quite right. My apologies. Then I suppose I'll need permission from all of you before I can stay." The boy seemed taken aback by this response. He studied her for a long moment, then turned and shouted toward the house. "Pa, the new teacher's here." The door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. Wyatt Boone wasn't what Eleanor had expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd been expecting. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, hardened build of a man who worked from sunup to sundown. His face was weathered the way leather weathers, creased by sun and wind and, she suspected, worry. Dark hair shot through with gray, dark eyes that assessed her with a directness she found both unnerving and refreshing. He wore denims and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with the scars of hard work. He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 35, certainly not more than 40. And there was something in the way he held himself, a kind of careful stillness that suggested a man who'd learned to move gently in a world full of sharp edges. "Miss Pike," he said, his voice a deep rumble that carried easily across the yard. "You made it." "Mrs. Pike," Eleanor corrected automatically, then immediately regretted it. It was a lie she'd told so often it had become reflex, a shield against the questions that came when people learned she was unmarried at her age. Something flickered in Wyatt's eyes, not judgment, but understanding, which was somehow worse. He descended the porch steps with an easy grace and crossed to the gate, swinging it open. "Mrs. Pike," he amended, and if he didn't believe her, he had the courtesy not to show it. "Come on up to the house. You must be tired from the journey." Eleanor picked up her bag, but Wyatt took it from her with a gentle insistence. "I've got it," he said. Then to the boy who was still watching with suspicious eyes, "Eli, go tell the others to come meet Mrs. Pike, and for God's sake, make sure they're decent." Eli took off at a run, and Eleanor followed Wyatt toward the house. Up close, she could see the care that had gone into the place despite its rough appearance. The porch steps were solid, the windows recently glazed, the door hanging straight and true. Inside, the house was dim and surprisingly cool after the blazing sun. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting room all at once. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a scarred table and mismatched chairs occupied the center, and in one corner stood a rocking chair with what looked like mending piled on the seat. "It's not much," Wyatt said, setting her bag down near the door, "but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak, at least not much." "It's fine," Eleanor said, and meant it. She'd lived in worse places. "The letter mentioned 4 children?" "Yes, ma'am, 4. Wyatt moved to the stove where a pot of coffee sat warming. He poured 2 cups without asking and handed her one. "You met Eli. He's 11, best I can figure. Then there's Mara. She's 9. Tommy's 7, and June's the baby at 4. They're good kids, but they've been through a lot. They don't trust easy." "I don't imagine they would," Eleanor said, accepting the coffee. It was strong and bitter, but hot, and she was grateful for it. "The man on the stagecoach told me their circumstances." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Did he now? What else did he tell you?" Eleanor met his gaze directly. "That they're not yours by blood. That their mother, your wife, died 3 years ago. That the county has questions about your fitness to keep them." For a long moment, Wyatt didn't respond. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "That's all true. I won't lie to you about any of it. My wife Clara and we couldn't have children of our own. So we took in the ones nobody else wanted. First it was just Eli, found him half-starved by a wagon train, parents both dead of cholera. Then Mara came from a family passing through, too many mouths to feed, and she was one too many. Tommy's mother died in childbirth. Father drank himself to death 6 months later. And June—" He paused, and Eleanor saw his throat work. "June was left on our doorstep in a basket. Couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Never did find out where she came from." "And your wife?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Influenza. Took her in 3 days. She was the heart of this family, and when she died—" Wyatt's voice roughened. "Well, things got harder. The county marshal came by last year, said there were concerns about me raising 4 children alone, especially children I'd never legally adopted. Said there needed to be a woman in the house to make it proper, to make sure the children were being raised right. He gave me 6 months to find a wife or a housekeeper, or they'd take the kids to the orphanage in Cheyenne." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. "That's why you needed a teacher, to show the county there's a woman here." "Partly," Wyatt admitted, "but also because the kids need education. They need more than I can give them. I can teach them to rope and ride, to read sign and survive out here. But you can teach them the things Clara would have taught them. How to think and speak proper, how to make their way in the world beyond this valley. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of running feet announced the arrival of the other children. They burst through the door in a tumble of noise and motion, Eli leading the way, followed by a girl with tangled blonde hair and fierce blue eyes who must be Mara, then a smaller boy with a gap-toothed grin who could only be Tommy, and finally, clinging to Eli's hand, the smallest child Eleanor had ever seen who wasn't still a baby. June was tiny, all enormous dark eyes and delicate features, wearing a dress that had been mended so many times it was more patches than original fabric. She regarded Eleanor with the wary intensity of a wild creature deciding whether to flee or investigate. The children lined up in front of Eleanor with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Eli still suspicious, Mara openly defiant, Tommy curious, and June hiding half behind her brothers. "Children," Wyatt said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is Mrs. Pike. She's come a long way to be your teacher." "We don't need a teacher," Mara said, echoing Eli's earlier declaration. "We do just fine." "Is that so?" Eleanor set down her coffee cup and studied the girl. "Can you write your name?" Mara's chin came up. "I can write it in the dirt with a stick. Can you write it on paper with ink? Can you write a letter to someone who lives far away? Can you read a book?" Eleanor kept her voice mild, conversational. "Because those things matter, you know. The world is bigger than this valley, and someday you might want to see some of it. Education is how you make choices instead of just accepting whatever life hands you." Something flickered in Mara's eyes. Not quite agreement, but at least a glimmer of consideration. It was Tommy who broke the standoff, stepping forward with that gap-toothed grin. "Can you really read books?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "I can," Eleanor confirmed. "I've read hundreds of them." "Hundreds?" Tommy's eyes went wide. "Are there really that many books in the whole world?" "More than you could read in 10 lifetimes," Eleanor said, and felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. This moment of a child's mind opening to possibility. This was why she'd kept teaching even when everything else had fallen apart. "And if you'd like, I can teach you to read them too." "Could you read us a story?" Tommy asked eagerly. "Right now?" Wyatt started to intervene. "Tommy, Mrs. Pike just got here. She's tired." "I'd be happy to," Eleanor interrupted. She opened her carpet bag and withdrew the book she'd carried across half the country, a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales, its spine cracked from countless readings. "Shall we sit outside? It's too fine an afternoon to waste indoors." The children's faces transformed. Even Eli's suspicion softened into something like interest, and Mara's defiance gave way to curiosity. They followed Eleanor out to the porch, and she settled into the rocking chair while they arranged themselves on the steps below her. June, after a moment's hesitation, climbed up into Eleanor's lap with the unself-conscious trust of very young children. Eleanor opened the book, feeling the familiar weight of it in her hands, and began to read. She'd always had a gift for voices. She could make the wolf sound menacing and the princess sound brave, could shift from narrator to character with ease. The children were transfixed, their eyes fixed on her face as the story unfolded. Even Wyatt, who'd followed them outside and now leaned against the porch rail, seemed caught up in the tale. As she read, Eleanor felt something inside her chest begin to unknot. Some tension she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. The weight of June in her lap, warm and solid. The rapt attention of the older children. The way the late afternoon light turned everything golden and gentle. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. When the story ended, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then Tommy burst out, "Read another one." "Tomorrow," Eleanor promised. "I think Mrs. Pike needs to rest now," Wyatt said gently, "and you all have chores to finish before supper." The children dispersed with varying degrees of reluctance, even Mara looking back over her shoulder as if to make sure Eleanor wouldn't disappear. Only June remained, still nestled in Eleanor's lap, her small hand clutched in Eleanor's skirt. "June," Wyatt said softly, "come on, sweetheart. Let Mrs. Pike get settled." But June burrowed deeper against Eleanor's chest, and Eleanor found herself tightening her arms around the child instinctively. She's fine, she said. If it's all right with you. Wyatt's expression softened into something unreadable. Sure, if you don't mind. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the ranch settling into evening around them, the horses moving in the corral, the chickens Eleanor hadn't noticed before scratching in the dirt, the distant lowing of cattle somewhere up the valley. The sun was sinking toward the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. There's something I need to tell you, Eleanor said finally, the words coming harder than she'd expected. Before we go any further. Before you show me where I'll be staying, or we talk about salary, or any of the practical matters. She paused, gathering her courage. I can't have children. Wyatt turned to look at her, his dark eyes steady and patient. Eleanor forced herself to continue. I was married once, years ago. My husband and I, we tried. For 5 years we tried, but I couldn't. Her voice caught. The doctors said I was barren. That's the word they used, barren, like a field that won't bear crops. She expected pity or embarrassment or the careful distance people always put between themselves and women like her, women who failed at the one thing society said they were meant to do. Instead, Wyatt crossed to the rocking chair and crouched down so they were at eye level. Mrs. Pike, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Look at me. She did, though it cost her. You being here isn't about bearing children. It's about raising them, teaching them, showing them there's more to life than survival. He gestured toward the yard where the children had disappeared. Those 4 kids in there, they've already been born. They've already been abandoned or orphaned or given up on. What they need isn't a woman who can give birth. What they need is a woman who can give them a future. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. The man on the stagecoach said you needed a wife to satisfy the county. I need a woman in this house who cares about those children, Wyatt corrected. Whether you're a teacher or a housekeeper or something else, that's between you and me and nobody else's business. As far as the county is concerned, you're here in a respectable capacity, and that's all that matters. He paused, then added quietly, and for what it's worth, that husband of yours was a fool. Any man who'd judge a woman's worth by whether she can bear children isn't worth the air he breathes. The tears escaped then, tracking hot down Eleanor's cheeks. She couldn't remember the last time someone had defended her like that, had looked at her brokenness and seen something whole instead. June stirred in her lap, looking up with those enormous dark eyes. Why are you crying? The child asked in a small, clear voice. Eleanor managed a shaky laugh and wiped her eyes. Because sometimes people say exactly the right thing at exactly the right time, and it makes you feel like maybe the world isn't as hard as you thought it was. June considered this with the seriousness only a 4-year-old can muster. Then she reached up and patted Eleanor's cheek with one small hand. Don't be sad. We like you. And just like that, the last of Eleanor's careful defenses crumbled. She pulled the child close and let herself cry. Not the bitter tears of grief and loss she'd shed so many times before, but something softer, something that felt almost like relief. Wyatt stood and moved back to the porch rail, giving her space while staying close enough that she wouldn't feel alone. He understood, she realized. He knew what it was like to carry weight that no one else could see, to feel broken in ways that didn't show. When Eleanor had composed herself, she looked up to find the sun had nearly set. The sky now a deep purple shot through with gold. I should probably see where I'll be staying, she said, if the offer still stands. The offer stands, Wyatt confirmed, and will stand as long as you want it to. He led her inside, June still attached to her like a small barnacle, and showed her to a room off the main space, small but clean, with a real bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. This was Clara's sewing room, he said, but it hasn't been used for much since, well, it's yours now if you want it. Eleanor set her carpet bag on the bed and looked around. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust, and there were still spools of thread lined up on the dresser like soldiers. Evidence of a woman who'd lived here, loved here, tried to make beauty in this harsh place. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. Supper's in about an hour, Wyatt said. Nothing fancy. Just stew and cornbread. But you're welcome to rest until then. After he left, pulling June gently along with promises of helping with the chickens, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and let the reality of her situation settle over her. She was here, in Wyoming territory, in a valley that barely registered on any map, in a house full of orphan children and one cowboy who smiled through heartache. She should have been terrified, should have been questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Fragile and tentative as new grass after winter, but real. Eleanor unpacked her few belongings with methodical care, hanging her dresses on pegs driven into the wall, arranging her hairbrush and the few toiletries she owned on the dresser. When she reached the bottom of her bag, her hand closed around the small wooden box she never opened. She sat holding it for a long moment, running her thumb over the carved lid. Inside was a child's ribbon, pale blue silk, faded now, and a lock of downy hair. The only evidence that once, for 3 brief days, she'd been a mother. The baby had been born too early, too small. He'd lived just long enough for her to name him, Thomas, after her father, and then he'd slipped away like smoke. Her husband had blamed her. The doctors had blamed her. She'd blamed herself. For years, she'd carried that box like a stone around her neck, unable to let it go, but unable to look at what was inside. Now, sitting in this small room in a borrowed house full of borrowed children, Eleanor opened the box and looked at the ribbon and the lock of hair. "I didn't forget you," she whispered. "I could never forget you." But for the first time, looking at those relics didn't feel like drowning. It felt like remembrance, honoring, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of forgiveness. A knock on the door made her start. "Mrs. Pike." It was Mara's voice, uncertain. "Pa says supper's ready." Eleanor closed the box gently and set it on the dresser. "I'll be right there." When she emerged, she found the table set with mismatched plates and cups, steam rising from a pot of stew that actually smelled delicious. The children were already seated, remarkably clean-faced and tidy compared to earlier. Wyatt stood by the stove, ladling stew into bowls with practiced efficiency. "Sit anywhere," he said, gesturing to the empty chair. "We're not formal here." Eleanor took the seat between Tommy and Mara and found herself the recipient of Tommy's gap-toothed grin. "Pa never makes stew this good when it's just us," he confided in a stage whisper. "He must be trying to impress you." "Tommy," Wyatt said in a warning tone, but Eleanor caught the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Well, it's working," Eleanor said, accepting her bowl. "I'm very impressed." Dinner was a chaotic affair. Tommy talked constantly, asking questions about every book Eleanor had ever read. Mara remained quiet but watchful, her eyes tracking Eleanor's every move. Eli ate mechanically, still clearly undecided about this new addition to their household. And June, seated on a stack of books to reach the table, kept reaching over to pat Eleanor's arm, as if to make sure she was real. Wyatt presided over it all with a patience Eleanor found remarkable. He refereed disputes, enforced basic table manners, and somehow managed to eat his own meal in between managing everyone else's. He was good at this, she realized. Natural. Whatever else might be true about his fitness to raise these children, there was no question he loved them. After dinner, the children were dispatched to various chores, dishes, feeding the chickens, bringing in wood for the morning fire. Eleanor offered to help, but Wyatt waved her off. "You've traveled enough today. Besides, it's good for them to have routine. Helps them feel secure." They ended up back on the porch, watching the last light drain from the sky and the stars begin to emerge. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. "I should probably know more about what's expected of me," Eleanor said after a while. "Teaching hours, curriculum, that sort of thing." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Truth is, I'm making this up as I go. I never hired a teacher before. Clara used to teach them their letters, but since she's been gone..." He trailed off, then seemed to gather himself. "What I'd like is for you to spend mornings on proper schooling, reading, writing, arithmetic, whatever else you think they need. Afternoons they'll do chores, and evenings are for family time. Sundays we rest, mostly, though there's always work to be done on a ranch." "That seems reasonable," Eleanor said. What about supplies, books, slates, that sort of thing? There's a general store in Clearwater. Make a list of what you need, and I'll ride in next week to fetch it. Or you can come along if you'd like. Probably good for the county to see you're really here. Eleanor nodded, filing this away. The county. The ever-present threat hanging over this makeshift family. How long do we have before the marshal comes back? 3 months, give or take. He said he'd check in again come September. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Long enough for him to see we're doing things proper. And if he decides we're not, then I lose them. Wyatt's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, but Eleanor could hear the fear underneath. They'll go to the orphanage in Cheyenne, where they'll be split up and sent to whoever will take them. Farmers looking for cheap labor, mostly. Or worse. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Then we'll make sure that doesn't happen. Wyatt turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his face was all plains and shadows. You're not what I expected, Mrs. Pike. What did you expect? Someone older, harder, someone who'd see this as just a job. He paused. You already care about them. I can see it. Eleanor didn't bother denying it. I've always been a fool that way, caring too much too fast. It's gotten me hurt before. Yeah, Wyatt said softly. Me too. They sat in comfortable silence after that, until the children began emerging from the house in their night clothes, worn shirts and patched trousers, a nightgown for Mara that had been lengthened so many times it looked like patchwork. They gathered on the porch like moths drawn to light. Story time? Tommy asked hopefully. Eleanor glanced at Wyatt, who nodded. Short one. It's late. So Eleanor retrieved her book and by lamplight read them another tale. This one about a girl who was clever and brave and saved herself. When she finished, the children were drooping with exhaustion, even Eli struggling to keep his eyes open. Wyatt herded them toward the loft where they slept, but June broke free and ran back to Eleanor, throwing her small arms around Eleanor's neck. You'll be here tomorrow? The child whispered, her voice anxious. Eleanor felt her heart crack and mend in the same instant. I'll be here tomorrow, she promised, and the day after that, and the day after that. June nodded, satisfied, and allowed Wyatt to carry her up to bed. Eleanor could hear him moving around upstairs, the murmur of his voice as he settled them down, the creak of floorboards, the sounds of a father tucking in his children. She sat on the porch until he came back down, until the lamp upstairs went dark and the house settled into sleep. When he joined her again, he carried 2 cups of coffee. Thank you, he said simply, for staying, for reading to them, for everything. Don't thank me yet, Eleanor replied. I haven't done anything but read a few stories. You gave them hope, Wyatt said. That's not nothing. Eleanor accepted the coffee and cradled it in her hands, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. I should tell you something else. About why I came here. All right. I was married, she began, the words coming easier now in the darkness, to a man named Robert Pike. We met in Philadelphia. He was a clerk. I was a school teacher. It seemed like a sensible match. We were married 5 years, and in that time, I got pregnant 3 times. She paused, forcing herself to continue. The first 2, I lost before the 3rd month. The 3rd, he lived for 3 days. Long enough to break my heart. Wyatt said nothing, just listened with that same patient stillness. After that, Robert couldn't look at me anymore. He said I'd failed him, failed my duty as a wife. The doctors agreed. They said my womb was inhospitable, that I'd never carry a child to term. Robert left me 6 months later. Got the marriage annulled on grounds that I couldn't fulfill my marital obligations. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I kept his name, though. Seemed easier than explaining to everyone why I was Miss Winchester again at 23. I'm sorry, Wyatt said quietly. For all of it. For the loss, and for him being a coward. I don't tell you this for pity, Eleanor said. I tell you because you should know who you've hired. I'm a woman who couldn't keep her own child alive. Some might say that makes me unfit to teach anyone else's. Some would be damn fools then. Wyatt set down his coffee cup with a soft clink. Eleanor. Can I call you Eleanor? She nodded. Eleanor, you didn't fail that baby. Bodies fail sometimes. It's not a moral judgment, it's just biology. And anyone who thinks a woman's only worth is in childbearing isn't worth the time it takes to argue with them. He leaned forward, his voice intense. Those children upstairs, they don't need someone who can give birth. They need someone who can give them a reason to believe in tomorrow. Can you do that? Eleanor thought about it, really thought about it. Could she? Could she look at these broken, wary children and promise them a future? Could she stand between them and a world that wanted to separate them, to reduce them to paperwork and problems? She thought about June's small hand on her cheek, about Tommy's wonder at the thought of hundreds of books, about Mara's fierce defiance and Eli's protective suspicion, about Wyatt, this weathered cowboy who'd built a family from discarded pieces and refused to let go. Yes, she said, I can. Wyatt smiled then, a real smile, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less burdened. Then that's all that matters. They sat together as the stars wheeled overhead, and the coyotes sang their ancient songs. Two broken people who'd somehow found their way to the same unlikely place. And for the first time since she'd buried her son in a grave so small it barely seemed real, Eleanor let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Tomorrow, she'd begin teaching. Tomorrow, she'd start building something that might last. But tonight, she'd already done the hardest thing. She'd said yes to hope. The first light of dawn came soft through Eleanor's window, turning the mountains from black to purple to gold. She woke to the sound of roosters crowing and footsteps creaking overhead, the children stirring in their loft, Wyatt's deeper tread moving through the house. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar room, the quality of silence that was so different from the city. Then memory returned. Wyoming, the ranch, 4 children who needed her, a cowboy who'd smiled and said her barrenness was good enough. She dressed quickly in her plainest work dress, pinned her hair into a severe bun, and emerged to find chaos already in full swing. Tommy was chasing chickens in the yard, laughing like a wild thing. Mara sat on the porch steps, braiding June's hair with fierce concentration, while the little girl squirmed and whined. Eli was nowhere to be seen, but Eleanor could hear the sound of an axe biting wood somewhere behind the barn. Wyatt stood at the stove, flipping flapjacks with one hand while trying to pour coffee with the other. He looked up when Eleanor entered, and something in his expression shifted. Relief, maybe, or just acknowledgement that she'd actually stayed the night. "Morning," he said. "Hope the roosters didn't wake you too early." "I'm used to early rising," Eleanor replied. "Can I help?" "Can you keep those flapjacks from burning while I deal with the coffee situation?" Eleanor took the spatula from him, their fingers brushing briefly in the transfer. The touch was innocent, practical, but it sent an unexpected jolt through her, a reminder that she'd been alone for a very long time, that the warmth of human contact was something she'd almost forgotten she needed. She focused on the flapjacks, flipping them with careful precision. Wyatt moved around the kitchen with easy efficiency, gathering plates, calling the children in for breakfast. They came reluctantly. Tommy still flushed from his chicken chasing, Mara, with June's hair now neatly braided, Eli appearing from wherever he'd been with wood shavings caught in his dark hair. Breakfast was as chaotic as dinner had been, but there was a rhythm to it that Eleanor found herself sliding into naturally. She poured milk, settled disputes over who got the last flapjack, wiped syrup off June's face 3 times before giving up and letting the child be sticky. Wyatt caught her eye across the table at one point and smiled. Not the careful, measured smile of last night, but something easier, more genuine. After breakfast, the children scattered to morning chores, and Eleanor found herself alone with Wyatt in the kitchen, washing dishes in companionable silence. He washed, she dried, and the simple domesticity of it felt both strange and right. "So," Wyatt said after a while, "you ready to try teaching this crew?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Eleanor replied. "Though I should warn you, I've never taught anyone quite this energetic before." Wyatt laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "That's a polite way of putting it. Clara used to say they were half children, half wild animals." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife so casually, without the weight of grief pulling his words down. Eleanor took it as a good sign, a measure of trust. "Tell me about her," she said. "If you don't mind." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilled in the dishwater. She was good. Better than me in just about every way. Patient where I was quick to anger, gentle where I was rough. She saw these kids, saw all the broken pieces the world tried to throw away, and she just loved them. Simple as that. Didn't matter where they came from or what they'd been through. She just loved them like they were hers. She sounds remarkable. She was. Wyatt pulled his hands from the water, dried them on a towel. She'd be glad you're here. She worried at the end about what would happen to them if anything happened to her. Made me promise I'd keep them together, no matter what. Then that's what we'll do, Eleanor said firmly, whatever it takes. Wyatt looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You mean that? I don't say things I don't mean. Something passed between them then. Not attraction exactly, though Eleanor couldn't deny there was an element of that. More like recognition. Two people who'd been broken by life and somehow kept going anyway, finding themselves in the same impossible place, fighting the same impossible fight. The moment was broken by Tommy bursting through the door. "Mrs. Pike, Pa says you're going to start teaching us today. Can we do it outside? It's too nice to be inside." Eleanor smiled at his enthusiasm. "We can start outside. But you'll need to gather your siblings and meet me by that big cottonwood tree by the creek. And bring anything you use for writing, slates, chalk, whatever you have." Tommy took off like a shot, hollering for the others. Eleanor gathered her book and the few supplies she'd brought and made her way down to the creek. The cottonwood was ancient and massive, its branches spreading wide enough to shade a dozen people. The ground beneath it was soft with fallen leaves, and the sound of water moving over rocks provided a peaceful backdrop. The children assembled slowly, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Tommy arrived first, practically vibrating with excitement. Mara came next, her expression carefully neutral, carrying a cracked slate and a stub of chalk. Eli followed, his arms crossed over his chest, making it clear he was only here under duress. And June toddled along last, clutching a stick she'd apparently decided was her writing implement. Eleanor settled herself on a fallen log and gestured for them to sit. "Before we begin, I want to understand what you already know. Tommy, can you write your name for me?" Tommy took the slate eagerly and scratched out Tommy in uneven letters. Eleanor nodded encouragingly. "Very good, though we'll work on adding that second M, Mara." Mara's letters were more controlled, her name spelled correctly, though her hand clearly wasn't used to writing. Eli, when pressed, could write his name and several other words, but his grip on the chalk was awkward, his letters cramped and difficult to read. June just drew circles and seemed perfectly content with that. "All right," Eleanor said, "we have some work to do, but that's not a bad foundation. Let's start with the alphabet." What followed was 2 hours of the most challenging teaching Eleanor had ever attempted. Tommy couldn't sit still for more than 30 seconds, constantly jumping up to chase butterflies or investigate interesting rocks. Mara was attentive but resistant, questioning everything Eleanor said as if waiting for her to prove she knew what she was talking about. Eli participated with the bare minimum of effort, his expression making it clear he thought this was all a waste of time. And June was 4, which meant she had the attention span of a hummingbird and needed constant redirection. By the time Eleanor called a break, she was exhausted and questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. The children scattered immediately, racing down to the creek to wade and play. Eleanor sat on her log, feeling the sweat cooling on her neck, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Wyatt appeared from around the barn, leading a horse. He tied the animal to the corral fence and walked down to where Eleanor sat. "How'd it go?" "Honestly, I'm not sure." Eleanor rubbed her temples. "They're bright enough, but getting them to focus is like trying to herd cats." Wyatt smiled sympathetically. "Clara used to say the same thing. It gets easier once they trust you. Right now, they're testing you, seeing if you'll stay or run like the others." "The others?" "We've had 3 teachers before you. First one lasted 2 days before she decided ranch life wasn't for her. Second one made it a week before Tommy put a frog in her shoe and she left in tears. Third one?" Wyatt's expression darkened. "Third one hit Eli with a ruler for talking back. I sent her packing that same hour." Eleanor felt something fierce and protective flare in her chest. I won't hit them. I know, Wyatt said quietly. I saw the way you looked at June last night. You're not here to hurt them. Eleanor watched the children playing in the creek, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Mara had picked up June and was spinning her around, the little girl shrieking with delight. Tommy and Eli were engaged in some elaborate game involving sticks and rocks, their earlier tension forgotten in the simple joy of play. They're good kids, she said softly. Under all the wildness and the testing, they're good. Yeah, Wyatt agreed. They are. They've just been hurt enough times that they've learned to be wild first, to keep people at a distance, safer that way. Eleanor understood that impulse all too well. How long before lunch? About an hour. Why? I have an idea. Eleanor stood, brushing leaves from her skirt. Is there a place in town that sells sweets, peppermint sticks, or lemon drops? Wyatt's eyebrows rose. You planning to bribe them? I prefer to think of it as positive reinforcement, Eleanor said primly. But yes, essentially, if they can get through an entire afternoon lesson without running off, I'd like to reward them. Build some positive associations with learning. There's a jar of horehound candy in the pantry. Claire kept it for special occasions. You're welcome to use it. That afternoon, Eleanor reconvened lessons with a new strategy. She kept them shorter, breaking instruction into 15-minute chunks with movement breaks in between. She turned spelling into a game, having them race to write words in the dirt. She had them practice their numbers by counting rocks and sticks, making it physical and active rather than sedentary. And at the end, when they'd made it through 2 solid hours with minimal chaos, she produced the horehound candy. The children's faces lit up like Christmas morning. Even Eli's careful facade cracked into something approaching a smile. You did good work today, Eleanor told them as they savored their treats. All of you. Tomorrow we'll go a little further, but for today, you should be proud of yourselves. The days began to blur together into a pattern that felt almost like routine. Eleanor woke with the sun, helped with breakfast, taught lessons until noon. Afternoons were for the children's chores, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, helping in the vegetable garden that Mara tended with surprising care. Evenings brought supper, story time, and the gentle settling of the house into sleep. Eleanor found herself learning the rhythms of ranch life almost without meaning to. She learned which chickens were good layers and which were just ornery. She learned that the brown cow, Bess, would kick if you approached from the left, but was gentle as a lamb from the right. She learned the sound of Wyatt's footsteps, could distinguish them from the children's even in the dark. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the children began to soften toward her. Tommy started showing her his treasures, interesting rocks, bird feathers, a perfectly round robin's egg he'd found abandoned. Mara began staying after lessons to ask questions, hungry for knowledge in a way that broke Eleanor's heart because she recognized it. It was the hunger of a smart child who'd never had anyone take her intelligence seriously. Eli was harder to reach, but Eleanor was patient. She noticed he had a gift for numbers, could calculate in his head faster than she could work it out on slate. So she started giving him harder problems, challenges that engaged his mind instead of boring it. The first time he solved a complex equation and looked up at her with genuine surprise and pride, she knew she'd won a small victory. And June? June attached herself to Eleanor like a shadow, following her everywhere, constantly reaching for her hand or climbing into her lap. The child was starved for maternal affection in a way that made Eleanor ache. She remembered what Wyatt had said, that June had been left on their doorstep as an infant, never knowing who her mother was or why she'd been given away. 3 weeks into her tenure at the ranch, Eleanor woke in the middle of the night to the sound of crying. She lit her lamp and followed the sound to the base of the ladder leading to the children's loft. The crying was coming from above, small, hiccuping sobs that tried to be quiet but couldn't quite manage it. Eleanor climbed the ladder carefully, mindful of the worn rungs. The loft was one large space under the sloped roof, divided by hanging blankets into sleeping areas. The crying was coming from the corner where June slept. Eleanor made her way over, finding the child curled in a ball, tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in gasps. "June, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Eleanor knelt beside the narrow cot, laying a gentle hand on the child's back. June's eyes flew open, wide with fear. "Bad dream," she whimpered. "Scary." "It's all right now. You're safe." Eleanor gathered the child into her arms, feeling the small body shake with residual fear. "Do you want to tell me about it?" June buried her face in Eleanor's shoulder. "Lost," she whispered. "Everyone gone. Calling and calling, but nobody comes." Eleanor's throat tightened. She rocked the child gently, humming a song her own mother had sung to her a lifetime ago. Around them, the other children slept on, Mara in the next bed over, the boys in their sectioned area beyond the blanket. Only June was awake, trapped in the terror of her dreams. "You're not lost," Eleanor murmured. "You're right here, safe and warm, and I'm here. Your pa is downstairs. Mara and Tommy and Eli are all right here with you. Nobody's leaving." "Promise?" June's voice was so small, so desperately hopeful. "I promise." And as Eleanor said it, she realized she meant it. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, this place had become home. These children had become hers in all the ways that mattered. The thought should have terrified her. She'd sworn never to let herself care this much again, never to give her heart away to children who could be lost. But it was too late now. She was already in love with all of them. She stayed in the loft, rocking June until the child's breathing evened out and she drifted back to sleep. Only then did Eleanor carefully return her to bed, tucking the thin blanket around her small form. As she turned to leave, she found Mara watching her from the next bed, her eyes glinting in the lamplight. "She has those dreams a lot," Mara whispered. "Ever since she was tiny, Ma used to say June would carry the scar of being left her whole life, that the best we could do was just keep showing up, keep proving we wouldn't leave too." Eleanor moved closer, crouching beside Mara's bed. "That's very wise. Your mom must have been a remarkable woman." "She was." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to stay, Mrs. Pike? Or are you going to leave like the others?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all of Mara's fears and all of Eleanor's complicated history. Eleanor could have deflected, could have given some vague reassurance. Instead, she chose honesty. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "I want to stay more than I've wanted anything in a long time. But I can't promise nothing will ever force me to leave, because life doesn't work that way. What I can promise is that I'll fight to stay. That I won't leave because things get hard or because you kids are difficult. I'll only leave if I have absolutely no other choice." Mara studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I guess that's fair." She paused. "You're different from the others. You don't look at us like we're problems to solve. You look at us like we're just people." "That's because you are," Eleanor said simply. "You're people who deserve to be loved and taught and given a chance at a real future. That's all any child deserves." "Even orphans? Even kids nobody wanted?" Eleanor felt her heart crack wide open. "Especially those kids, because they're the ones who need it most." When Eleanor finally climbed back down the ladder, she found Wyatt sitting at the kitchen table, a single lamp burning, his hands wrapped around a cup of what was probably cold coffee by now. He looked up as she descended, his expression unreadable. "June?" he asked simply. "Nightmare. She's asleep again now." Eleanor moved to the stove, finding the coffee pot still warm. She poured herself a cup and joined him at the table. "Mara says she has them often." Wyatt nodded heavily. "Ever since she was old enough to dream, seems like. Clara thought maybe she remembered somehow, being left, being alone, or maybe it's just in her bones, that fear of abandonment." He rubbed his face tiredly. "I've tried everything. Nightlights, special bedtime routines, even sleeping on the floor next to her cot. Nothing stops them completely." "Maybe nothing can," Eleanor said gently. "Some wounds are too deep to ever completely heal. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to make it better." They sat in silence for a while. The only sound the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional pop from the dying fire. Eleanor found herself studying Wyatt in the lamplight. The lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried constant tension, the gentle strength in his hands even when they were still. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. Why did you and Clara take them in? The children, I mean. Most people in your situation would have, well, they would have focused on their own lives, maybe kept trying for children of their own. Wyatt was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. We did try. For years, we tried. Clara had 3 miscarriages in 4 years, and each one nearly destroyed her. After the third, the doctor told us trying again might kill her, said her body just couldn't carry a child to term. Eleanor's breath caught. The parallel to her own story was so exact it made her dizzy. I told her it didn't matter, Wyatt continued, that having her was enough, that we'd make a life just the 2 of us. But she was heartbroken, felt like she'd failed somehow, like she'd let me down. He looked up at Eleanor, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears. Then one day, we found Eli. He was maybe 6 years old, half-starved, hiding in our barn. His parents had died on the wagon train, and nobody wanted to take responsibility for another mouth to feed. Claire took one look at him and said, "This is how we're meant to be parents." "So you kept him?" "We kept him, and then we kept the others as they came. And you know what? Clara never felt like a failure again. She loved those kids like they'd come from her own body. She was happy." His voice broke on the last word. She was finally happy. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand without thinking, squeezing it gently. She'd be proud of you, of how you've kept them together, kept fighting for them. Wyatt's fingers tightened around hers. Some days I'm not sure I'm doing right by them. I'm just a cowboy, Eleanor. I know horses and cattle and how to survive in hard country. But teaching them? Helping them grow into good people? That was Clara's gift, not mine. You're doing fine, Eleanor said firmly. More than fine. Those children are fed and clothed and safe. They know they're loved. That's not nothing, Wyatt. That's everything. He looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. Having you here, it's made a difference. They're calmer, happier. Even Eli's starting to come around, and he's the hardest one to reach. They're good kids, Eleanor said. They just needed someone to believe in them. So did I, Wyatt said quietly. So did I. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. It wasn't attraction, or not just attraction. It was recognition, understanding, the sense of 2 people who'd been fighting separate battles suddenly realizing they were on the same battlefield. Eleanor pulled her hand back gently, suddenly aware of impropriety, of boundaries she should probably maintain. It's late. We should both try to get some sleep. Yeah. Wyatt stood, stretching his back with an audible crack. Thank you, Eleanor, for staying with June, for everything. It's what I'm here for, Eleanor said, and meant it. The next morning dawned hot and bright, promising a scorcher of a day. Eleanor adapted the lessons, moving them even earlier and keeping them shorter. She taught them about cloud formations and weather patterns, turning the blazing sky into a classroom. She had them practice their letters by writing in the dirt with sticks, making it play as much as work. By noon, everyone was wilting from the heat. Wyatt declared the afternoon too hot for chores and suggested they all go swimming in the creek at the deep bend where the water pooled. The children whooped with excitement, racing off to change into clothes suitable for swimming. Eleanor hesitated, suddenly aware that she had nothing appropriate for such activity. But Mara appeared at her elbow, shy but determined. Ma had a swimming dress. It's old-fashioned, but Pa kept it. You're about her size, you could wear it. The thought of wearing a dead woman's clothes should have felt wrong, but somehow it didn't. Clara felt less like a ghost and more like a presence in this house, someone who'd want her things used and loved rather than locked away gathering dust. The swimming dress was indeed old-fashioned, with a full skirt and bloomers underneath, but it fit well enough. Eleanor joined the family at the creek, watching as Wyatt taught Tommy to float on his back while Mara waded in the shallows with June. Eli sat on the bank, his feet in the water, carefully whittling a piece of wood into what might eventually be a whistle. "Come on in," Wyatt called to Eleanor. "Water's perfect." Eleanor waded in cautiously, gasping at the shock of cold after the heat of the day. The water was crystal clear, running over smooth rocks, the current gentle but persistent. She could see small fish darting through the shallows, the play of sunlight on the water's surface. June broke free from Mara and paddled over to Eleanor with all the confidence of a fish. The child clearly had no fear of water, dunking her head under and coming up laughing, her dark hair plastered to her skull. Eleanor found herself laughing too, swept up in the simple joy of a hot day and cold water and children playing without fear or worry. Wyatt swam over, his hair wet and slicked back, water streaming down his face. "You look happy," he observed. "I am happy," Eleanor realized with some surprise. "I can't remember the last time I felt this light." "It's the water," Wyatt said with a smile. "Washes away everything except what matters." They floated side by side in the gentle current, watching the children play, and Eleanor felt something in her chest unknot, some tension she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost or what she could never have. She was just here, now, in this moment with these people who were becoming her family. That evening, after supper and stories, after the children had been tucked into bed and the house had settled into quiet, Eleanor found herself back on the porch with Wyatt. It had become their routine, these quiet evening conversations under the stars. A time to decompress from the day, to share observations about the children, to simply exist in each other's company without expectation or demand. "The marshal's coming next week," Wyatt said without preamble. "County sent word today when I was checking the mailbox at the crossroads." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. "Already? I thought we had more time." "So did I. But apparently there's been some pressure from the town council, people asking questions about propriety, about whether it's appropriate for an unmarried man and woman to be living under the same roof, even with the children here." Wyatt's voice was tight with anger. As if any of them gave a damn about these kids before. As if they didn't turn a blind eye when the children needed help. "What do we need to do?" Eleanor asked, forcing her voice to stay calm even as her heart raced. "Show him we're doing things proper, that the kids are being educated, that there's a woman's influence in the house, that everything is respectable and above board." Wyatt ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I hate this. Hate having to prove to strangers that I love these children, that I'm capable of raising them right." "I know," Eleanor said softly. "But if it keeps them safe, keeps them with you, then we'll do whatever we have to do." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "You mean that? You're really willing to fight for them?" "I told you the first night, I don't say things I don't mean." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "These children are mine now too, Wyatt. Maybe not by blood or law, but in every way that matters. Nobody's taking them without a fight." Something fierce and grateful flashed across Wyatt's face. He reached for her hand, and this time Eleanor didn't pull away. They sat like that, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel overhead, drawing strength from each other for the battle ahead. Neither of them spoke of the growing feeling between them, the way Eleanor's breath caught when Wyatt smiled, the way Wyatt's eyes followed Eleanor when she moved through the house, the comfortable silence that spoke of deep understanding. There wasn't time for such things. There was only the fight ahead, the children to protect, the family to save. But the feeling was there nonetheless, growing like prairie grass after rain, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The week before the marshal's visit passed in a blur of preparation that felt equal parts necessary and absurd. Eleanor threw herself into making the house look as respectable as possible, scrubbing floors that were already clean, mending curtains that hardly needed mending, organizing shelves with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The children caught her anxiety like a fever, growing quieter and more watchful as the days ticked down. On Tuesday, Eleanor was beating dust from the rug on the porch when Mara appeared beside her, her face tight with worry. "Mrs. Pike, what happens if the marshal doesn't think we're good enough? What if he says Pa can't keep us?" Eleanor set down the rug beater and pulled the girl close, feeling the tension in her thin shoulders. "Then we'll figure something else out. But that's not going to happen, Mara. You're good children being raised by a good man. The marshal will see that." "The last marshal didn't," Mara said quietly. "The one before this one. He came 2 years ago, after Ma died. He looked at us like we were cattle at auction, trying to figure out what we were worth. He told Pa that orphans belonged in orphanages, not on ranches, that Pa was being selfish keeping us here." Eleanor felt anger flare hot in her chest. "What did your Pa say?" He said we were his children, orphanage or no orphanage, and that the marshal could go straight to hell if he thought otherwise. A ghost of a smile crossed Mara's face. Ma would have washed his mouth out with soap for cursing, but she'd have agreed with the sentiment. So would I, Eleanor said firmly. And this time, there's two of us standing between you and anyone who tries to take you away. That has to count for something. Wednesday brought unexpected rain, a blessing after weeks of heat, but a complication for Eleanor's plans to showcase the children's outdoor learning. She adapted quickly, turning the main room into a classroom and drilling them on their letters and numbers with an intensity that had Tommy squirming in his chair and even Eli paying close attention. Wyatt watched from the doorway at one point, his expression unreadable, before disappearing back outside to tend to the animals in the downpour. That evening, as Eleanor helped clear the supper dishes, Wyatt caught her arm gently. "You're pushing too hard. The kids are wound tight as springs, and you look like you haven't slept in days." "I'm fine," Eleanor said automatically. "You're not fine. None of us are." Wyatt's voice was gentle but firm. "Come on, let's take a walk." "In the rain?" "It's letting up. Besides, sometimes you need the weather to match how you're feeling inside." They left the children under Eli's watchful supervision and walked out into the damp evening. The rain had indeed slowed to a fine mist, and the air smelled of wet sage and earth. The mountains were hidden behind low clouds, and everything felt close and intimate, like the world had shrunk down to just this valley, just this moment. They walked in silence for a while, following the creek path Eleanor had come to know so well. Finally, Wyatt spoke. "I'm scared, Eleanor. I haven't said it out loud to anyone, but I'm terrified. What if we've done all this and it's still not enough? What if the marshal takes one look at us and decides we're not fit?" Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him. In the dim light, she could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Then we appeal. We fight. We get a lawyer if we have to." "With what money?" I'm barely keeping this ranch afloat as it is. A lawyer would cost more than I make in 6 months." "Then we'll find another way." Eleanor reached for his hands, holding them firmly in hers. "Wyatt, listen to me. Those children belong with you. Anyone with eyes can see that. They're loved and cared for and growing into good people. That has to matter more than paperwork and regulations." "In a fair world, maybe. But the world's not fair, Eleanor. You know that as well as I do." "I do," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean we stop fighting. That doesn't mean we give up." Wyatt pulled her closer, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might kiss her. Instead, he just rested his forehead against hers, both of them drawing comfort from the simple contact, the knowledge that they weren't facing this alone. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying, for caring about them, for being here." "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," Eleanor said, and realized it was the absolute truth. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Eleanor was teaching the children about fractions using slices of cornbread when the sound of hoofbeats made everyone freeze. Visitors were rare out here, and unannounced visitors almost never meant good news. Wyatt emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans, his expression wary. Eleanor ushered the children inside and watched from the window as a portly man on a tired-looking horse reined up in the yard. He was dressed in town clothes, a suit that had seen better days, and a bowler hat that looked ridiculous in ranch country. "Mr. Boone," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly to where Eleanor stood. "Name's Chester Hartley. I'm with the Territorial Welfare Office. I believe you're expecting Marshal Reeves next week, but I wanted to come by ahead of time, get a sense of the situation before making any official reports." Eleanor's blood ran cold. This wasn't the marshal they'd been preparing for. This was someone else entirely, someone they hadn't expected and didn't know how to handle. She watched Wyatt's shoulders tense, saw him force himself to relax and extend a hand in greeting. "Mr. Hartley, welcome to the ranch. Can I offer you some coffee?" "That would be appreciated. Thank you." Wyatt caught Eleanor's eye through the window and gave a slight nod. She understood immediately, time to put on the show they'd been rehearsing, to prove they were a proper household. She smoothed her skirt, checked that her hair was tidy, and opened the door with a smile she didn't feel. "Mr. Hartley, please come in. I'm Mrs. Eleanor Pike, the children's teacher." Hartley removed his ridiculous hat and studied her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Pike, how long have you been in residence here?" "About a month now," Eleanor replied, gesturing for him to take a seat at the table. "The children are making wonderful progress with their studies." "Are they now?" Hartley settled himself heavily into a chair, his gaze sweeping the room with the methodical attention of a man trained to spot irregularities. The children had frozen in their seats, eyeing the stranger with obvious suspicion. "And where are you from, Mrs. Pike?" "Philadelphia originally. More recently, Denver." Eleanor poured coffee with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. "I taught school there before coming to Wyoming." "Philadelphia," Hartley repeated, as if testing the word. "Long way from home." "This is my home now," Eleanor said firmly. Hartley pulled out a small notebook and pencil. "I'll need to ask you some questions. And the children. Standard procedure, you understand." What followed was one of the most excruciating hours of Eleanor's life. Hartley asked probing questions about the household arrangements, about her relationship with Wyatt, about the children's routines and education. He asked to see where everyone slept, inspecting the house with an invasive thoroughness that made Eleanor's skin crawl. He questioned each child separately, and Eleanor's heart broke watching June's face crumple with confusion and fear. When he finally finished, Hartley closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "I'll be frank with you, Mr. Boone. The situation here is irregular. 4 children, none of them legally yours, being raised by a single man with only a female teacher for propriety's sake. There are concerns about whether this arrangement is in the children's best interests." "These children are in their best interests right here," Wyatt said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They're fed, clothed, educated, and loved. What more could an orphanage give them? Structure, proper moral guidance, preparation for useful trades or domestic service." Hartley ticked off the points as if reading from a list. "And most importantly, legal oversight. The territory has a responsibility to ensure orphan children are being raised according to proper standards." "Proper standards," Wyatt repeated flatly. "You mean workhouses for the boys and scullery positions for the girls? That's what happens to orphans who go to Cheyenne." "That's a rather cynical view, Mr. Boone." "It's a realistic view. I've seen what happens to children in those places." Hartley stood, retrieving his hat. "Be that as it may, I'll be making my report to Marshal Reeves. He'll conduct his own investigation when he arrives next week, and then a determination will be made." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, the children seem healthy and well cared for. But the law is the law, and appearances matter. You do well to remember that." After Hartley left, the house fell into stunned silence. The children huddled together on the porch, their earlier ease replaced by fear. Wyatt stood by the window, his hands braced against the frame, his whole body radiating tension. Eleanor felt utterly helpless, wanting to comfort everyone and not knowing how. It was June who broke the silence, her small voice trembling. "Is the man going to take us away?" "No," Wyatt said, turning to gather her up in his arms. "No, sweetheart. Nobody's taking you anywhere." But Eleanor saw the doubt in his eyes, the fear he was trying so hard to hide from the children. She saw it because she felt it too. The terrible understanding that sometimes love wasn't enough, that the world could tear apart families for the sake of regulations and propriety. That night, after the children were finally settled into an uneasy sleep, Eleanor found Wyatt sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. She sat beside him without speaking, just offering her presence. They sat that way for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. "I can't lose them," Wyatt finally said, his voice raw. "Clara made me promise. She was dying, and she grabbed my hand so tight it hurt, and she made me promise I'd keep them together no matter what. How do I keep that promise if the law says I can't?" Eleanor didn't have an answer. She just took his hand and held it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers that was so carefully controlled around the children. Friday dawned gray and oppressive, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. The children moved through their morning routines with unusual quietness, their earlier playfulness replaced by worry. Even Tommy couldn't muster his usual enthusiasm, sitting through lessons with uncharacteristic stillness. Eleanor was helping Mara with a particularly difficult arithmetic problem when the girl suddenly looked up, her blue eyes bright with tears. "Mrs. Pike, if they take us away, will you forget about us?" The question hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She set down her pencil and pulled Mara close. "Never, not ever. You four are written on my heart now. Even if I never saw you again, which I refuse to believe will happen, I would carry you with me for the rest of my life." "Ma used to say that," Mara whispered, "that we were written on her heart. I didn't really understand what it meant until after she died. Then I felt like my own heart had words carved into it that would never go away." Eleanor held the girl tighter, feeling her own eyes burn with tears. Around them, the other children had gone silent, listening. Even Eli had stopped pretending to work and was watching them with an expression that was older than his years. "Listen to me, all of you," Eleanor said, her voice fierce. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But fear doesn't mean we give up. It means we fight harder. Your pa loves you, I love you, and we're going to do everything in our power to keep this family together." "What if it's not enough?" Eli asked, his voice rough. "What if they decide the law matters more than love?" "Then we'll appeal. We'll find a way." Eleanor met each child's eyes in turn. "But I need you all to trust me when I say this. I will not abandon you. Your pa will not abandon you. We're going to fight for you with everything we have." The weekend passed in a strange limbo, everyone trying to maintain normalcy while feeling like they were walking on the edge of a precipice. Sunday. They didn't attend church in Clearwater as some families did. It was too far, and Wyatt had always conducted his own sort of worship here at the ranch. But this Sunday felt different. After breakfast, Wyatt gathered them all in the main room. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice gruff. "But I need you kids to know something. No matter what happens this week, no matter what any marshal or welfare officer says, you are my children. Maybe not by blood, maybe not by law, but in every way that actually matters. And if they try to take you, they're going to have to go through me first." "And me," Eleanor added firmly. "I may not have been here long, but I meant what I said. You're my family now too." Tommy, ever the optimist, managed a watery smile. "We're a strange family, aren't we? All cobbled together from different pieces." "The best things usually are," Wyatt said, pulling the boy into a hug. "The best things usually are." Monday morning arrived with brutal sunshine, as if the universe was mocking their anxiety with beautiful weather. Eleanor woke early, her stomach in knots, and found Wyatt already up, standing by the window and staring out at the mountains. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked quietly. "Didn't try. Seemed pointless." He turned to look at her, and in the early morning light, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the toll this waiting was taking. "Eleanor, if this goes bad, if they decide to take the children, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let them separate the kids. Fight for them to stay together, even if it means going to Cheyenne with them. They need each other. Losing Clara almost broke them. Losing each other would finish the job." Eleanor crossed to him and took both his hands in hers. "It's not going to come to that. But if it does, yes. I promise. I'll follow them to Cheyenne or the ends of the earth if I have to." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression, gratitude and something deeper, something that made Eleanor's breath catch. He reached up and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "How did I get so lucky," he murmured, "to have you walk through that gate a month ago?" "I'm the lucky one," Eleanor replied. "I was so lost before I came here. I thought my life was over, that I'd never have a purpose beyond just surviving. But these children, this place, you've given me a reason to hope again." They stood like that, hands clasped, faces close, balanced on the edge of something neither of them had the luxury to explore. Then the sound of small feet overhead broke the moment, and they stepped apart as the children began their morning descent from the loft. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor taught lessons, but her heart wasn't in it, and neither were the children's. They went through the motions, reciting multiplication tables and practicing penmanship, but everyone was listening for hoofbeats, waiting for the marshal to arrive. He came in the late afternoon when the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains. Marshal Reeves was younger than Eleanor expected, maybe 40, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. He arrived with Chester Hartley in tow, their horses raising dust as they cantered into the yard. Wyatt met them at the gate, his posture rigid with tension. Eleanor stood on the porch with the children clustered behind her like a protective wall. Or maybe she was their protective wall. Either way, they stood together. "Mr. Boone," Marshal Reeves said, dismounting with practiced ease, "I'm here to conduct a formal evaluation of your household and determine whether the current living arrangements are suitable for the continued care of 4 minor children." "Marshal," Wyatt replied evenly, "welcome to my home." What followed was even more invasive than Hartley's visit. Marshal Reeves questioned everyone separately, inspected every corner of the house and property, examined the children's sleeping arrangements, and asked probing questions about their daily routines. He spent a full hour going through Eleanor's teaching materials and questioning the children about what they'd learned. When he finally called Wyatt and Eleanor into the house for a private conference, leaving the children outside under Hartley's supervision, Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Marshal Reeves sat at the head of the table, his expression grave. "I'm going to be direct with you both. The situation here is highly irregular. Mr. Boone, you have no legal claim to any of these children. Mrs. Pike, you've been here barely a month, which hardly establishes you as a stable presence in their lives. By all rights, I should be arranging transport to the Territorial Orphanage in Cheyenne right now." "Please," Wyatt said, his voice breaking. "Please don't do this. They're good kids. They're thriving here. Sending them to an orphanage—" "Let me finish," Marshal Reeves interrupted, but not unkindly. "I said by all rights I should, but I've been a lawman long enough to know that the law and justice aren't always the same thing." He leaned back in his chair, studying them both. "Those children are clearly loved. They're healthy, educated, and from what I can see, genuinely happy. Mrs. Pike, your presence here provides the female influence the territory requires. And Mr. Boone, despite your lack of legal claim, you are these children's father in every way that matters." Eleanor felt hope flare in her chest, almost painful in its intensity. "So you'll let them stay?" "I'll recommend they stay with conditions." Marshal Reeves pulled out an official-looking document. "First, Mrs. Pike must remain in residence as educator and moral guardian. Second, you'll need to begin formal adoption proceedings for all 4 children. It'll be expensive and take time, but it's the only way to establish legal claim. Third, I'll be conducting quarterly visits for the next year to ensure standards are being maintained." "We can do that," Wyatt said quickly. "All of it, whatever it takes." "There's one more thing." Marshal Reeves looked between them, his expression unreadable. "The situation of an unmarried man and woman living under the same roof, even with children present, is going to continue raising eyebrows. It would be simpler if that situation were to change." Eleanor's mouth went dry. "You're saying we should marry?" "I'm saying it would resolve a number of bureaucratic concerns and make my job considerably easier." Marshal Reeves stood, gathering his papers. "But that's your decision to make, not mine. I'll file my report recommending the children remain in your custody. The adoption papers will need to be filed within 6 months, or we'll need to revisit this situation." After the Marshal and Hartley left, after the dust from their horses' departure had settled, Wyatt and Eleanor stood in the yard in stunned silence. The children erupted from where they'd been waiting by the barn, racing over with questions tumbling over each other. "Are they taking us away? Do we have to leave? Can we stay?" "Yes," Wyatt said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes. You can stay. You're staying right here where you belong." The celebration that followed was chaotic and joyful, the children dancing around and whooping with relief. Even Eli cracked a real smile, and Mara burst into tears and hugged Eleanor so tightly it hurt. June climbed into Wyatt's arms and refused to let go, her small face pressed against his shoulder. That evening, after the children had finally been coaxed to bed, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day, Eleanor and Wyatt found themselves once again on the porch. But this time, the air between them was charged with a different kind of tension. "He suggested we should marry," Wyatt said finally, breaking the silence. "The Marshal." "I know." Eleanor kept her eyes on the darkening horizon. "It would solve the bureaucratic problems." "That's not a reason to marry someone." "No, it's not. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Wyatt spoke again, his voice careful. What if there were other reasons? Eleanor's heart stuttered. What kind of reasons? The kind where I've watched you with those kids for a month and seen how much you love them. The kind where I find myself looking for you the moment I walk into a room. The kind where the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I'm drowning. He turned to face her fully. Eleanor, I'm not asking you to marry me out of convenience or to satisfy some bureaucrat. I'm asking because somewhere in the last month, you became essential to my life. You and those kids. You're what I wake up for every morning. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Wyatt, you barely know me. We've known each other 4 weeks. I know enough. I know you're brave and kind and stubborn as a mule when you believe in something. I know you sing to June when she has nightmares and you stay up late helping Mara with arithmetic even when you're exhausted. I know you make Tommy laugh and you never gave up on Eli even when he was determined to hate you. I know that when you walked through my gate with that worn carpet bag and told me you couldn't have children, I thought you might be the answer to a prayer I didn't know I was praying. This is insane, Eleanor whispered, but she was smiling through her tears. People don't fall in love in 4 weeks. Don't they? Clara always said she knew she'd marry me the day we met. Took me 3 months to convince her, but she said she knew right away. Wyatt reached for Eleanor's hand. I'm not saying it's the same, I'm just saying sometimes you know. And I know that losing you would hurt almost as much as losing those kids. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, at this man who'd shown her what family could look like when it was built on choice instead of obligation. She thought about June's small hand in hers, about Mara's fierce intelligence, about Tommy's laughter, and Eli's slow-blooming trust. She thought about mornings making breakfast together, and evenings reading stories, and the simple rightness of being here, being needed, being part of something bigger than her own broken dreams. I'm barren, Wyatt, she said, needing him to understand fully. If you marry me, there will never be children from our bodies. Only these 4. These 4 are more than enough, Wyatt said firmly. They're everything. And so are you. Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, the last wall she'd built around her heart, the final defense against hope. Then yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Wyatt pulled her close, and this time he did kiss her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. We should tell the children, Eleanor said. Tomorrow, Wyatt replied. Tonight, let's just sit here and be grateful we all get to stay together. So they sat on the porch under the stars, hands clasped, hearts full, and somewhere inside the house, 4 children slept peacefully, unaware that their family had just become permanent in a way none of them could have imagined. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Eleanor woke before dawn, her mind spinning with the enormity of what she'd agreed to the night before. Marriage. To a man she'd known barely a month. To become not just a teacher, but a mother to 4 children who'd already lost so much. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was madness, that she was repeating old mistakes, that she should run before anyone got hurt. But the rest of her, the part that had felt dead for years, whispered that this was exactly where she was meant to be. She dressed carefully, choosing her best dress, the deep blue one she'd been saving for something special. If they were going to tell the children today, she wanted to look like someone worthy of becoming their mother. Her hand shook as she pinned her hair, and she had to start over twice before getting it right. When she emerged from her room, she found Wyatt already at the stove, making coffee with the focused intensity of a man who hadn't slept much either. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression softened. You look beautiful, he said simply. I look nervous, Eleanor corrected, but she was smiling. That too. Wyatt poured her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing in the exchange. We don't have to tell them today, if you're not ready. We could wait. No, Eleanor interrupted. They deserve to know. They've had enough uncertainty in their lives. Let's give them something certain. The children tumbled down from the loft in their usual chaotic fashion, Tommy leading the charge with his hair sticking up in every direction, Mara following with June's hand clutched in hers, Eli bringing up the rear with his customary wariness. They seemed to sense something different in the air, their movements slowing as they took in Eleanor's dress and the way Wyatt stood close beside her. "Kids," Wyatt said once they were all seated around the table with their breakfast, "Mrs. Pike and I have something we need to talk to you about." 4 pairs of eyes fixed on them with varying degrees of anxiety. Eleanor saw Mara's hand reach for June's under the table, saw Eli's shoulders tense, saw Tommy's gap-toothed smile fade into uncertainty. "Is it bad?" Tommy asked in a small voice. "Did the marshal change his mind?" "Nobody, nothing like that." Wyatt glanced at Eleanor, who nodded encouragement. "The thing is, Marshal Reeves made it clear that for you all to stay here permanently, there needs to be a proper family structure. And Mrs. Pike and I, well, we've decided that we'd like to be a proper family. A real one." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor watched the children's faces, trying to read their reactions. Confusion on Tommy's face, calculation on Eli's. Something that might have been hope flickering in Mara's eyes. June just looked from one adult to the other, waiting for someone to explain in words she could understand. "You mean you're getting married?" Mara asked finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Eleanor said, finding her own voice. "If that's all right with you, all of you, we wanted to ask your permission because this affects everyone, not just the 2 of us." "Will you be our ma then?" Tommy asked, his eyes going wide. "Like our real ma?" Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "I could never replace your ma, the woman who loved you first. But I'd like to be a mother to you, if you'll let me. A different kind of mother, maybe, but one who loves you just as much." June tugged on Mara's sleeve and whispered something too quiet for Eleanor to hear. Mara leaned down, listened, then looked up with tears shining in her eyes. "June wants to know if this means you'll stay forever, that you won't leave like Ma did." Eleanor crossed to where June sat and knelt beside her chair, taking the small hands in hers. "I can't promise I'll never die, sweetheart, because nobody can promise that. But I can promise that I will never, ever choose to leave you. You're stuck with me now, all of you, for as long as I'm breathing." June threw her arms around Eleanor's neck with such force it nearly knocked her over. Eleanor held the child close, feeling hot tears soak into her shoulder, and looked up to find the other children watching with expressions that ranged from tentative hope to cautious acceptance. It was Eli who spoke next, his voice rough. "Pa, are you sure about this? You barely know her." "I know enough," Wyatt said firmly. "And Eli, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about satisfying the marshal or keeping you kids here, though that's part of it. This is about building a real family. Mrs. Pike makes me happy. She makes all of us better, and life's too short and too hard to pass up a chance at happiness when it comes along." Eli studied them both for a long moment, his young face far too serious. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Ma would have liked her," he said quietly. "Ma would have wanted us to have someone who cared like Mrs. Pike does." "Yeah," Mara agreed, wiping her eyes. "Yeah, she would have." Tommy, ever the optimist, bounced in his seat with renewed energy. "So, when's the wedding? Can we have cake? Will Mrs. Pike wear a fancy dress? Can I be in charge of something important?" Despite the tension, everyone laughed. Wyatt reached over and ruffled Tommy's wild hair. "We'll figure all that out. But first, I think Mrs. Pike needs a proper proposal. The kids are present, everyone gets a say kind of proposal." He crossed to Eleanor, who was still kneeling by June's chair, and took her hand to help her stand. Then, to Eleanor's shock and the children's delighted gasps, he dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the kitchen. "Eleanor Pike," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You came into our lives like rain after a drought. You brought hope when we'd almost forgotten what it felt like. You loved these children before you had any reason to, and you loved them hard enough to fight for them. I'm asking you now, in front of these 4 witnesses, to be my wife, to be their mother, to be part of this strange, cobbled-together family we're building. Will you marry me?" Eleanor looked around at the faces watching her, Wyatt's hopeful and open, the children's ranging from excited to cautiously optimistic. She thought about all the years she'd spent believing she was broken, believing she had nothing to offer, believing her life was essentially over. And here, in this rough ranch house in the middle of nowhere, she'd found everything she'd been missing. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. 1,000 times yes. The children erupted into cheers and questions and plans, the kitchen dissolving into happy chaos. Tommy wanted to know if they could have fireworks at the wedding. Mara asked if Eleanor would take their last name or keep Pike. June just clung to Eleanor's skirt, beaming up at her with a smile that could have powered the sun. Even Eli cracked a real smile, the wariness in his eyes finally starting to ease. Later, after the children had been sent outside to do their morning chores, Eleanor and Wyatt stood at the kitchen window watching them play. The relief and joy had settled into something quieter, but no less profound. "I need to tell you something," Eleanor said, her voice low. "Before we go any further, before we make this official." Wyatt turned to face her, concern flickering across his features. "What is it?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "The baby I lost. Thomas. I never told you the whole story. He was born too early, far too early. I was only 6 months along when the labor started. The doctor said it was my fault, that I'd worked too hard, that I'd been too stressed. My husband blamed me, his family blamed me, and I blamed myself for so long that I started to believe I was cursed somehow, that I was never meant to be a mother." "Eleanor, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I need to say this. After Thomas died, after my marriage fell apart, I tried to kill myself. I took laudanum, enough to stop my heart. My landlady found me and got the doctor in time, but for weeks afterward, I wished she hadn't. I wished I'd succeeded." Wyatt's face had gone pale, but he didn't interrupt, just took her hands and held them firmly. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know who you're marrying. I'm not some innocent victim who just got dealt a bad hand. I tried to give up. I tried to quit. And there are still days when I wake up and the darkness is there, whispering that I'm not good enough, that I'll fail these children the way I failed my son." "But you didn't fail your son," Wyatt said fiercely. "Bodies fail sometimes, medicine fails, but you, your love, your heart, that didn't fail. And you haven't failed these children. If anything, you've saved them. You've saved all of us." Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I just needed you to know. Before you committed to this, you needed to know the whole truth." Wyatt pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that made her ache. "Thank you for telling me, for trusting me with that. But Eleanor, listen to me. Everyone's got darkness in their past. Everyone's got moments they're not proud of. What matters is that you're still here. You're still fighting, and you're fighting for people who need you desperately." They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other, until Tommy's voice calling about a snake near the chicken coop broke the spell and sent them both hurrying outside. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Eleanor and Wyatt decided on a simple ceremony, just family and a few close neighbors, to be held at the ranch under the big cottonwood tree by the creek. Eleanor had no family to invite, and Wyatt's people were all back east and estranged over his choice to raise orphans. But it didn't matter. The family that mattered was already here. The bigger challenge was the adoption papers. Wyatt rode into Clearwater to meet with a lawyer, taking Eleanor along to provide her testimony. The lawyer, a thin, nervous man named Abernathy, explained that the process would take at least 6 months and cost more than Wyatt had initially anticipated. "We're talking about legal adoption of 4 children, Abernathy said, shuffling papers on his cluttered desk. "That's 4 separate proceedings, 4 sets of fees, 4 court appearances. I can bundle them together to save some costs, but we're still looking at close to $300 when all's said and done." Eleanor saw Wyatt's face go tight. $300 was more than the ranch made in 6 months. It might as well have been $3,000. "Is there any way to reduce the cost?" Eleanor asked. "Any legal provisions for families who—" "I'm sorry, Mrs. Pike, the fees are set by the territorial government. I have no control over them." Abernathy looked genuinely sympathetic. "I can offer you a payment plan, but the adoptions can't be finalized until the fees are paid in full." They rode back to the ranch in heavy silence, the weight of impossible choices settling over them like dust. That night, after the children were in bed, Wyatt sat at the table with his head in his hands. "I could sell off part of the herd," he said. "The yearling steers would fetch maybe $150, but we need those steers for breeding stock. Selling them means mortgaging the ranch's future. What about taking on extra work? Eleanor suggested. Breaking horses for other ranchers, hiring out for roundups? Maybe. But that means leaving you alone with the kids for weeks at a time, and with the marshal doing quarterly checks. I'm not sure that's wise. Wyatt looked up at her with exhausted eyes. I keep thinking Clara would know what to do. She was always better at figuring out solutions when I couldn't see past the problem. Eleanor moved to stand behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. Then let's think like Clara would have thought. What would she suggest? Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. She'd tell us to ask for help, to let the community know what we need. She always said people were mostly good if you gave them the chance to prove it. Then that's what we'll do, Eleanor said firmly. We'll find a way. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following Sunday, Eleanor suggested they attend the church service in Clearwater, something Wyatt rarely did, preferring to keep his distance from town gossip. But Eleanor insisted, and so they all made the 7-mile trip. The children dressed in their best clothes, Wyatt in a clean shirt with his hair slicked back, Eleanor in her blue dress with her hair carefully pinned. The church was a simple wooden structure, packed with ranch families and townspeople who turned to stare as the Boone family filed in. Eleanor felt the weight of their gazes, heard the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. The unmarried man and his school teacher, the orphan children, the scandal of it all. But she held her head high and kept her hand on June's shoulder as they found seats near the back. Wyatt sat beside her, Tommy on his other side, and for all the world they looked like exactly what they were, a family. The sermon was about charity and community, about bearing one another's burdens. Reverend Matthews, a kind-faced man with a shock of white hair, spoke about how the strength of a community was measured not by its wealth, but by how it cared for its most vulnerable members. After the service, as people milled around outside, Eleanor made a decision. She approached Reverend Matthews directly, Wyatt trailing behind her, looking uncertain. "Reverend, might I have a word?" "Of course, Mrs. Pike. And congratulations are in order, I understand. Mr. Boone spoke to me last week about performing your marriage ceremony." "Thank you, yes. That's actually what I wanted to discuss." Eleanor took a deep breath, aware of the people edging closer to listen. "Wyatt and I are getting married so we can provide a stable home for 4 children who desperately need one, but we've run into a difficulty. The adoption fees for all 4 children are $300, money we simply don't have. We're not asking for charity, but if anyone in the community needs work done, or if there's any way to help us raise even part of that amount, we'd be grateful for the opportunity." The silence that followed was excruciating. Eleanor felt Wyatt tense beside her, saw several townspeople exchange glances. She'd taken a risk, laying their situation bare in front of everyone. It could backfire spectacularly. Then a woman stepped forward, Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store with her husband. "How much do you have so far?" "Nothing yet," Wyatt admitted. "I was planning to sell some cattle, but—" "Don't sell your breeding stock. That's foolish," Mrs. Henderson interrupted briskly. "George and I can contribute $25. We've always believed those children were better off with you than in some orphanage." "We can put in 15, another voice called out. Eleanor turned to see Mr. Patterson, Patterson, who owned the feed store. "My wife's been saying for months that someone ought to help those kids get proper legal standing." "The Mercantile Association could sponsor a fundraising social," someone else suggested. "A dance and auction. We've done it before for families in need." More voices chimed in, offering amounts ranging from $5 to $25, offering to donate goods for an auction, offering to help organize an event. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as the community that had seemed so judgmental revealed itself to be something else entirely. People who cared, who wanted to help, who understood that sometimes keeping a family together mattered more than regulations and propriety. By the time they left Clearwater that afternoon, they had commitments for nearly half the money they needed and a plan for a fundraising social to be held in 3 weeks. The children chattered excitedly in the back of the wagon about the party, about finally becoming really real family, about all the possibilities opening up before them. That night, after the excitement had died down and the children were asleep, Eleanor found herself once again on the porch with Wyatt. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang its lonely song. "Thank you," Wyatt said quietly, "for what you did today. I never would have had the courage to ask for help like that." "Clara would have," Eleanor replied. "You said it yourself. She believed in letting people be good. I just followed her example." Wyatt reached for her hand. "You know, I think you two would have been friends." Clara had this way of seeing straight through to the heart of things, of knowing what mattered and what didn't. "You have that same quality." "I wish I could have known her," Eleanor said honestly. "I wish she could see what you've built here, how you've honored her memory by keeping these children safe and loved." "She knows," Wyatt said with quiet certainty. "Wherever she is, she knows. And she's glad you're here." The fundraising social was scheduled for a Saturday evening, which gave Eleanor and the children 3 weeks to prepare. Mara threw herself into the project with unexpected enthusiasm, helping Eleanor bake cakes and pies for the auction, carefully decorating each one with intricate designs made from preserved fruits and nuts. Tommy appointed himself chief organizer, drawing up elaborate charts of who was bringing what and where everything should go. Even Eli participated, using his gift for numbers to help calculate costs and potential earnings. But it was June who surprised Eleanor most. The little girl, usually so quiet and clingy, insisted on making something special to contribute to the auction. She wanted to create a quilt square, even though she'd never sewn anything in her life. Eleanor found scraps of fabric, some from Clara's old sewing basket, some from worn-out clothes they'd been saving for rags, and patiently taught June how to make simple stitches. The child's tongue stuck out in concentration as she worked, her stitches uneven and wandering but made with fierce determination. "What are you making?" Eleanor asked after the third evening of June working on her project. "A family," June announced, holding up her square. And there they were, rendered in crooked stitches and mismatched fabric, 6 stick figures holding hands, 2 tall ones, 4 shorter ones, a family built from scraps and love. Eleanor felt her eyes burn with tears. "It's perfect, sweetheart. It's absolutely perfect." 2 weeks before the social, disaster struck. Eleanor woke in the middle of the night to the sound of June screaming, a sound of pure terror that sent her stumbling from her room in her nightgown. She found the child in her loft bed, thrashing and burning with fever, her skin hot enough to blister. "Wyatt!" Eleanor called, her voice sharp with fear. "Wyatt, something's wrong with June." He was up and climbing the ladder in seconds, his face going pale when he touched June's forehead. "Jesus, she's burning up. How long has she been like this?" "I don't know. I just heard her scream." Eleanor gathered the child in her arms, feeling the way she trembled and shook. "We need to get her fever down. Cold water, cloths." "I'll ride for the doctor," Wyatt said, already moving toward the ladder. "Clearwater's 7 miles away, and it's the middle of the night. By the time you get there and back..." Eleanor's voice broke. She'd seen fevers like this before. She'd watched her own son burn with fever in those final days. "We need to cool her down now. Help me get her downstairs." What followed were the longest hours of Eleanor's life. They stripped June down to her underclothes and sponged her with cool water, trying to bring the fever down. The child drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her mama. Not Eleanor, but Clara, the mother she'd lost 3 years ago. Sometimes she called for people whose names Eleanor didn't recognize, people from a past so early June probably didn't even remember them consciously. The other children woke and clustered at the top of the ladder, their faces pale and frightened. Wyatt sent them back to bed with promises that June would be fine, but Eleanor could see the fear in his eyes. He was remembering Clara, remembering how quickly fever had taken her. Around 3 in the morning, June began to seize, her small body convulsing in Eleanor's arms. Eleanor held her firm, protecting her head, whispering prayers she'd thought she'd forgotten. Wyatt stood frozen, his face ashen, clearly reliving the nightmare of losing someone else he loved. "Wyatt," Eleanor said sharply, "I need you here. I need you present. June needs both of us right now." Her words seemed to break through his paralysis. He crossed to them and took June's hand, holding it gently as the seizure passed and the child went limp and still. For one terrible moment, Eleanor thought they'd lost her. Then June took a shuddering breath, and another, and her eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" she whispered, looking at Eleanor with fever-glazed eyes. "I'm here, baby," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I'm right here." "Don't leave. Promise you won't leave." "Never. I promise. I'm staying right here." June's eyes drifted closed again, but this time she seemed to be sleeping rather than unconscious. Eleanor held her through the rest of the night, refusing to let go even when her arms went numb and her back ached from holding the same position. Wyatt stayed beside them, keeping the cool cloths coming, occasionally putting his hand on Eleanor's shoulder as if to reassure himself she was real. By dawn, the fever had broken. June woke properly, confused and weak, but clearly past the crisis. When Wyatt rode for the doctor at first light, it was for reassurance rather than emergency. Dr. Morrison made the trip out to the ranch and confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. June had come down with a bad case of ague, probably from playing too long in the creek. She'd be weak for a while, but she was past the worst of it. After the doctor left, Eleanor finally let herself collapse into a chair, shaking with exhaustion and delayed fear. Mara appeared at her elbow with a cup of coffee, and Eleanor looked up to find all 4 children watching her with expressions that made her chest tight. "You saved her," Eli said quietly. "When Pa froze up, you knew what to do. You saved her life." "Your Pa saved her too," Eleanor said firmly. "We saved her together. That's what family does." But she saw something shift in Eli's eyes, the last of his resistance finally crumbling. When he hugged her, quickly, awkwardly, but genuinely, Eleanor knew she'd finally won the approval of the hardest child to reach. The fundraising social happened on schedule, though Eleanor was exhausted from 3 nights of broken sleep sitting up with June as she recovered. The little girl was still weak but insisted on coming, wearing her best dress and clutching her quilt square like a talisman. The community center in Clearwater was decorated with bunting and lanterns, and it seemed like half the territory had turned out. There was music and dancing, tables groaning with donated food, and auction items ranging from practical to frivolous. Mrs. Henderson had organized everything with military precision, and the evening unfolded with surprising grace. When June's quilt square came up for auction, Eleanor expected it to sell for maybe $1 or $2, a pity purchase by someone kind. Instead, bidding started at $5 and quickly escalated. $10, $15, $20. Eleanor watched in amazement as Mr. Patterson and Mrs. Henderson got into a spirited bidding war, driving the price up to $35, an astronomical sum for a piece of amateur needlework. Mrs. Henderson won, and when she came to collect her prize, she knelt down to June's level. "This," she said, holding up the quilt square with its crooked family of stick figures, "is going to hang in the most prominent place in my store, because it shows what really matters in this life. Family, love, people fighting for each other. That's worth more than all the perfect stitching in the world." June beamed and threw her arms around Mrs. Henderson's neck, and Eleanor had to turn away to hide her tears. By the end of the night, they'd raised $420, more than enough for the adoption fees, with some left over for the ranch. People pressed money into Wyatt's hands, told him they were proud of what he was doing, told Eleanor they were glad she'd come to Bennett Valley. On the ride home, with the children dozing in the back of the wagon and the stars wheeling overhead, Wyatt reached for Eleanor's hand. "We did it," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We actually did it. The kids are going to be ours. Legally, officially, permanently ours." "We're going to be a real family," Eleanor agreed, "in every way that matters." The adoption proceedings were filed the following week, and Reverend Matthews agreed to perform their marriage ceremony in 2 weeks' time, just enough time for Eleanor to make herself a proper wedding dress from fabric Mrs. Henderson donated and for the children to practice their roles in the ceremony. The night before the wedding, Eleanor sat with Mara on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The girl had been quiet all day, and Eleanor sensed something weighing on her mind. "What is it, Mara? What's troubling you?" Mara was quiet for a long moment, picking at a loose thread on her skirt. "Tomorrow, when you marry Pa, you're really going to be our Ma. For real and forever." "That's right. And you won't change your mind, even if being a Ma is harder than you thought, even if we're difficult?" Eleanor pulled the girl close, understanding the fear beneath the questions. "Mara, listen to me. Being a mother is already hard. You've all been difficult at various points, and I haven't changed my mind yet, have I? No, Mara admitted. That's because love isn't something you change your mind about when it gets inconvenient. It's not a decision you make once and then have to keep remaking. It's just there, solid, permanent. Eleanor tilted Mara's face up to look at her. You are my daughter. All of you are my children. That became true the moment I decided it was true, and a wedding ceremony isn't going to make it any more real. It's just going to make it official. Mara's eyes filled with tears. I miss Ma sometimes. Clara, is that okay? Even though I love you too? Of course it's okay, Eleanor said gently. You should miss her. She was your first mother, and she loved you with all her heart. I'm not here to replace her or make you forget her. I'm just here to be a different kind of mother, one who knows about Clara and honors her memory by loving you the way she would have wanted you to be loved. They sat together as the last light faded from the sky, and Eleanor thought about the strange paths life took, the way broken things could be mended into something new and beautiful. Tomorrow, she would marry a man she'd known for barely 2 months. She would become mother to 4 children who'd started as strangers. She would build a family from pieces that shouldn't fit together, but somehow did. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor felt certain she was exactly where she belonged. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, the kind of spring day that made Wyoming territory feel less like a harsh wilderness and more like a promise. Eleanor woke before sunrise, her stomach fluttering with nerves and anticipation. Through her window, she could see the cottonwood tree by the creek, where the ceremony would take place, its branches already leafed out and moving gently in the breeze. She dressed slowly in the quiet darkness, savoring these last moments of being just Eleanor Pike, schoolteacher and woman alone. By sunset, she would be Eleanor Boone, wife and mother, permanently woven into the fabric of this family she'd come to love so fiercely. The wedding dress she'd made was simple, cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, nothing fancy but clean and new and hers. She pinned her hair carefully, letting a few tendrils frame her face the way Mara had suggested, and stood before the cracked mirror in her room. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who'd arrived at this ranch 2 months ago. That woman had been hollow-eyed and defeated, carrying grief like a stone around her neck. This woman had color in her cheeks and light in her eyes. This woman had purpose. A soft knock on her door interrupted her reflection. Mrs. Pike? It was Mara's voice, tentative and sweet. Can we come in? Eleanor opened the door to find all 4 children clustered outside, freshly scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday best. Mara wore a dress that had been let down and taken in so many times it was more alteration than original garment, but she'd tucked wildflowers into her blonde braid and her face was glowing. Tommy had attempted to slick his wild hair down with water, though several cowlicks were already springing free. Eli stood with his hands shoved in his pockets, trying to look nonchalant but failing to hide his excitement. And June wore a new dress, the only truly new piece of clothing any of them owned, made from fabric Mrs. Henderson had insisted on providing, with a sash that matched the blue of Eleanor's eyes. You look beautiful, Mara breathed, and the other children nodded agreement. Eleanor felt tears threaten and blinked them back firmly. So do all of you, the most beautiful children in Wyoming territory, I'd wager. Pa's nervous, Tommy announced with the casual brutality of 7-year-olds. He tried to shave and cut himself twice. Eli had to finish for him. Eleanor smiled at the image. Is he ready? He's been ready since dawn, Eli said, and there was something warm in his voice that made Eleanor's heart squeeze. He's been standing by that tree for the past hour, like he's afraid it might run away. Then I suppose I shouldn't keep him waiting. Eleanor took a deep breath, suddenly aware of the enormity of the moment. Children, before we go out there, I need to say something. I need you to know that I'm not just marrying your father today. I'm choosing all of you. I'm promising all of you that I'll be here, that I'll fight for you, that I'll love you for the rest of my life. You understand that? 4 heads nodded solemnly. Then June stepped forward and took Eleanor's hand with the grave seriousness only a 4-year-old can muster. You're our mama now, for real and always. For real and always, Eleanor agreed, her voice thick with emotion. They walked down to the creek together, the children forming a small procession around Eleanor.
Neighbors had already gathered under the cottonwood. Not many, perhaps 20 people total, but it felt like abundance. Mrs. Henderson was there with her husband, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Patterson and his wife stood with their 3 sons. Dr. Morrison had ridden out from Clearwater.
Several ranching families Eleanor had met at the fundraising social clustered in small groups, smiling and nodding as she approached. And there, standing beneath the spreading branches of the ancient tree with Reverend Matthews beside him, was Wyatt. He wore a suit Eleanor had never seen before, borrowed probably, or pulled from storage where it had waited since his first wedding. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved except for the small cuts Tommy had mentioned, and his eyes were fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her breath catch. He looked terrified and hopeful and so full of love it radiated from him like heat. Eleanor walked toward him with the children flanking her, Mara on one side, June clutching her hand on the other, the boys trailing slightly behind like an honor guard. This was right, she thought. This was how it should be. Not her father giving her away, but her children bringing her forward to build something new. When she reached Wyatt, he took both her hands in his, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers. "You're shaking," she murmured. "Terrified," he admitted with a crooked smile. "What if I mess up the vows?" "Then we'll laugh about it later," Eleanor said. "This is just the ceremony, Wyatt. We've already been building the marriage for weeks." Reverend Matthews cleared his throat gently. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony was simple and brief, the words familiar but weighted with new meaning. When Reverend Matthews asked who gave this woman to be married, it was Eli who stepped forward, the oldest, the one who'd been hardest to win over, and said in a clear, strong voice, "We do, all of us. We choose her to be our ma." Eleanor saw Wyatt's eyes glisten with tears, saw several of the neighbors pull out handkerchiefs. This wasn't how these ceremonies usually went, but then nothing about this family had ever been usual. The vows themselves were traditional, but when Wyatt spoke them, his voice was steady and sure. "I, Wyatt Boone, take you, Eleanor Pike, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Eleanor's voice was equally firm. "I, Eleanor Pike, take you, Wyatt Boone, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." There was no ring. They couldn't afford such luxuries, but Wyatt had braided a simple band from horsehair and copper wire, and he slipped it onto Eleanor's finger with a tenderness that made her throat tight. It was rough and imperfect, and more precious than gold. "By the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory and Almighty God," Reverend Matthews intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Wyatt, you may kiss your bride." Wyatt leaned in slowly, giving Eleanor time to close the distance if she wanted to. She did, meeting him halfway in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Around them, the small gathering erupted into applause and cheers, and the children rushed forward to embrace them both in a tangle of arms and laughter. Mrs. Henderson had organized a small reception, tables set up with food and drink, a fiddle player who struck up a cheerful tune, space cleared for dancing. Eleanor found herself swept from one conversation to another, accepting congratulations and well wishes, watching Wyatt do the same with an ease that surprised her. He was smiling more than she'd ever seen him smile. The weight of worry temporarily lifted from his shoulders. When the fiddle player started a waltz, Wyatt found Eleanor and pulled her into the cleared space. "I should warn you," he said as they began to move. "I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Eleanor admitted. "We'll stumble through together." They did stumble, both of them laughing when Wyatt stepped on her foot and when Eleanor lost the rhythm entirely. But they held each other close and swayed to the music, and Eleanor felt a happiness so complete it was almost painful. "Thank you," Wyatt murmured against her hair, "for saying yes, for staying, for loving them." "Thank you for letting me," Eleanor replied, "for seeing me as more than my failures, for giving me a family when I thought I'd never have one." They danced 3 more dances before the children demanded their turns. Eleanor waltzed with each of them in succession, Eli stiff and formal, Mara giggling and graceful, Tommy enthusiastic but chaotic, and June standing on Eleanor's feet and letting herself be carried around. By the end, Eleanor was breathless and laughing, her careful hairstyle coming undone, her dress dusty from the hem, and she'd never felt more beautiful in her life. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, the guests started to depart, offering final congratulations and promises to visit soon. Mrs. Henderson pressed a package into Eleanor's hands. A wedding gift. Don't open it until tonight. And Dr. Morrison reminded them he'd be back in 2 weeks to check on June's recovery. Mr. Patterson shook Wyatt's hand and said gruffly, "You did good, Boone, real good." Finally, it was just the 6 of them, the newly formed Boone family, standing in the golden evening light beneath their cottonwood tree. The children were wound up from the excitement, talking over each other about the ceremony and the dancing and who had eaten the most cake. "All right, you wild things," Wyatt said with mock sternness. "Time to settle down. We've got chores to do before full dark, wedding day or not." The children scattered to their tasks with surprising willingness, leaving Eleanor and Wyatt alone for a moment. He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head, and they stood together listening to the creek and the evening birdsong and the distant sound of the children's voices. "This is real now," Eleanor said softly. "We're really doing this." "We've been doing this since the day you arrived," Wyatt replied. "This just makes it official." That evening, after a supper of leftovers from the reception, and after the children had been corralled into washing up and changing into nightclothes, the family gathered in the main room. It had become their ritual, this time together before bed when the day's work was done and they could just be together. Eleanor settled into the rocking chair with June in her lap, the little girl already drowsy and thumb firmly planted in mouth. Mara sat at Eleanor's feet, leaning against her legs. The boys sprawled on the floor near Wyatt's chair, and for a moment Eleanor just looked at all of them, memorizing this tableau of her family. "Mrs." Mara started, then stopped and corrected herself with a shy smile. "Mama, will you read us a story?" The word "mama" hit Eleanor like a physical force. It was the first time any of the children except June had called her that directly. She saw Wyatt's head come up, saw the emotion flash across his face, saw the other children watching to see how she'd react. Eleanor's voice was steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I'd be honored to, sweetheart." She read them a story about a brave princess and a kind woodcutter and 4 children who saved a kingdom, and if her voice broke occasionally, none of them mentioned it. When she finished, Wyatt stood and stretched. "Bedtime. No arguments, not even from you, Tommy." There was the usual flurry of protests and negotiations, but eventually all 4 children climbed the ladder to the loft. Eleanor followed to help tuck them in, something she'd done countless times before, but that felt different now, weighted with new significance. She moved from bed to bed, smoothing blankets and dropping kisses on foreheads. When she reached Eli's cot, the boy looked up at her with serious eyes. "Ma, Eleanor, Mama," he stumbled over what to call her, and Eleanor's heart ached for his uncertainty. "Are you happy? Like, really happy? Or are you just doing this because you felt like you had to?" Eleanor sat on the edge of his narrow bed, taking one of his hands in hers. "Eli, I'm going to tell you something I want you to remember. I've been a lot of things in my life. Sad, angry, desperate, hopeless. But right now, at this exact moment, I am happier than I've ever been. Not because I have to be, not because it's expected, but because I get to be your mama. Because I get to be part of this strange, wonderful family. That's real, Eli, as real as anything I've ever felt." Eli studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, good. Because we're pretty happy you're here too. Even if I didn't show it at first." "You were protecting yourself," Eleanor said gently. "That's not wrong. That's smart. But I hope you know now that I'm not going anywhere." "Yeah," Eli said, and there was wonder in his voice. "Yeah, I think I do." When Eleanor finally descended the ladder, she found Wyatt banking the fire, preparing the house for night. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Come here," he said softly. She crossed to him, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that made her ache. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I should have said before but couldn't find the words."
What is it? When Clara died, I thought that was it. I thought I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it. And the best I could hope for was to survive and keep the kids safe. I never imagined, his voice roughened. I never imagined I'd feel this way again. That I'd wake up in the morning and look forward to the day because you'd be there. That I'd find myself wanting to do things not just because they needed doing, but because I wanted to share them with you. Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks. Wyatt, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I loved Clara. I'll always love Clara. She was my first love, and losing her almost destroyed me. But Eleanor, what I feel for you, it's different. Not less, just different. Like there was a part of my heart I didn't know existed until you showed up and claimed it. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I'm saying I love you, not because it's convenient, or because the law requires it, or because the kids need a mother. I love you because you're you, brave and stubborn and fierce and gentle all at once. I love you too, Eleanor whispered. So much it scares me sometimes, because I've lost so much before, and the thought of losing this, losing you and the children, you won't, Wyatt said firmly. We're building something that lasts, Eleanor, something real. They stood together in the quiet house, holding each other as the fire died down to embers and the stars came out overhead. This was home, Eleanor thought. Not the building or the land, but this, these people, this love, the sense of belonging she'd thought she'd never feel again. The weeks that followed the wedding fell into a new rhythm, one that felt both familiar and transformed. Eleanor was no longer Mrs. Pike the teacher, separate and slightly apart. She was Mama, fully integrated into the fabric of family life. She woke in the mornings in Wyatt's arms, helped make breakfast while trading quiet conversation and stolen kisses, taught lessons to children who now called her mother without hesitation. The adoption papers progressed slowly through the territorial bureaucracy, but lawyer Abernathy assured them everything was proceeding normally. Marshal Reeves made his quarterly visit 6 weeks after the wedding and pronounced himself satisfied with the arrangement. The children were clearly thriving, the household was running smoothly, and there was no question anymore about the legitimacy of the family structure. I'll put in my final report recommending permanent custody, the marshal told them as he prepared to leave. Should be official within another month or two. After that, these children are legally yours, and nobody can question it. After he rode away, Wyatt pulled Eleanor close and kissed her soundly. We did it. We actually did it. We did, Eleanor agreed. But she knew the real test wasn't paperwork and official stamps. It was the daily work of being a family. The morning chaos and evening settling, the scraped knees and hurt feelings, the slow accumulation of shared moments that built a life. Summer arrived in full force, bringing brutal heat and the constant work of ranch life. Eleanor learned to help with the vegetable garden, to collect eggs without getting pecked, to distinguish between the various cattle bellowing in the distance. The children grew brown and wild, their laughter ringing out across the valley as they played in the creek and explored the surrounding hills. One evening in late July, Eleanor was sitting on the porch shelling peas when Mara appeared beside her, unusually quiet. The girl had just turned 10. They'd celebrated with cake and a new book Eleanor had ordered from Denver, and she was shooting up like a weed, all long limbs and awkward grace. Mama, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Mara was quiet for a moment, watching her hands as she helped with the peas. Do you ever miss your old life before you came here? Eleanor considered the question carefully. Sometimes I miss certain things. There was a bakery in Denver that made the most wonderful cinnamon rolls, and I had a friend, another teacher, who made me laugh until my sides hurt. But miss my old life as a whole? No, because my old life was mostly about being lonely and feeling like I'd failed at everything that mattered. But you were free, Mara pointed out. You could go where you wanted, do what you wanted. Now you're stuck here with us. Mara, look at me. Eleanor waited until the girl met her eyes. I'm not stuck. I'm chosen. There's a difference. Every day I wake up and choose to be here, choose to be your mama, choose this life. That's not being trapped. That's being exactly where I want to be. Even when Tommy drives you crazy with his questions, even when June has nightmares and keeps you up half the night, even when I'm moody and difficult, Eleanor smiled and pulled the girl close. Especially then, because that's what family is, honey. It's choosing each other over and over, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Mara leaned into the embrace, and Eleanor felt the tension drain from her thin shoulders. They sat like that until Wyatt called them in for supper, and Eleanor thought about how far they'd all come. These children who'd learned to trust again, this man who'd learned to open his heart after devastating loss, and herself, the barren woman who'd found a different way to be a mother.
The adoption papers were finalized in August, arriving by special courier from Cheyenne on a sweltering afternoon when even the chickens were too hot to move. Lawyer Abernathy had enclosed a note saying he'd never seen such an easy approval. Apparently, Marshal Reeves's recommendation had carried significant weight, and several prominent citizens' testimonials had helped seal the decision. Wyatt read the official documents aloud to the family, his voice catching as he reached the final declaration. Be it known that Eli James Boone, Mara Louise Boone, Thomas William Boone, and June Marie Boone are hereby declared the legal children of Wyatt Robert Boone and Eleanor Mary Boone, with all rights and privileges thereof. The children erupted into cheers and questions, talking over each other in their excitement. But it was June who summed up what it meant most simply, climbing into Eleanor's lap and announcing with great satisfaction, "Now we're a real family, forever and ever." "Forever and ever," Eleanor agreed, holding the child close and looking around at the faces of her family, her husband, her children, the life she'd built from broken pieces and stubborn hope. That night, after the excitement had died down and the children were finally asleep, Eleanor stood at the window of the bedroom she now shared with Wyatt, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. She thought about the woman who'd arrived here 6 months ago, hollow-eyed and defeated, believing her life was essentially over at 28. That woman had been so lost, so certain that her barrenness defined her, that her inability to bear children meant she was fundamentally broken. But she'd been wrong about what it meant to be a mother. Being a mother wasn't about blood or biology or carrying a child in your womb. It was about showing up every day. It was about wiping tears and teaching lessons and fighting off nightmares. It was about choosing to love children who needed loving, about building a family from whatever pieces life gave you. She felt Wyatt's arm slip around her waist from behind, his chin coming to rest on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "About how Clara would have loved seeing this, seeing them so happy, so secure, seeing the family you built for her living and thriving." "The family we built," Wyatt corrected gently. "You're as much a part of this as she was, different but equal. You gave these kids something they desperately needed, proof that love could come again after loss. That opening your heart wasn't a betrayal of the past, but an honoring of it." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "I used to think my life was over when I couldn't have children. I thought that was my whole purpose, and without it, I was just taking up space, waiting to die. And now? Now I know that my son, Thomas, he wasn't my failure. He was my teacher. He taught me about love and loss and the preciousness of every moment. And that pain, as terrible as it was, prepared me to be the mother these 4 children needed. Someone who understood grief. Someone who knew what it felt like to be broken and still find reasons to keep living." She smiled through sudden tears. "I think maybe Thomas would be proud of me, of us, of this family we've made." Wyatt kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I know he would be, just like Clara is. Just like everyone who ever loved us is proud of what we've built here." They stood together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other the way they'd learned to do over these months of building a life together. Outside, a storm was rolling in from the mountains, bringing the promise of rain and the sharp scent of ozone. Inside, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and wanted and would never be abandoned again. The autumn that followed was the most beautiful Eleanor had ever experienced. The cottonwoods turned gold, the air grew crisp and clear, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of harvest and preparation for winter. Eleanor taught the children their lessons in the mornings and worked alongside them and Wyatt in the afternoons, learning the 1,000 small skills that made up ranch life. She learned to preserve vegetables and fruits for the winter, filling the cellar with jars of beans and tomatoes and peaches. She learned to render lard and make soap, to card wool and start a quilt. Mrs. Henderson became a regular visitor, teaching Eleanor the practical skills she'd never needed in her old life but were essential now. The children continued to grow and change in ways that filled Eleanor with pride. Eli had shot up several inches over the summer and was becoming a real help to Wyatt with the heavier work. His gift for numbers had evolved into a talent for ranch management, and he'd started keeping meticulous records of the cattle and horses. Mara had discovered a passion for drawing, filling slate after slate with sketches of the landscape and animals in her family. Tommy remained his exuberant self, but he'd developed a surprising gift for storytelling, entertaining them all at dinner with elaborate tales of his day's adventures. And June, no longer the tiny waif Eleanor had first met, was growing into a sturdy, confident little girl who tagged along with her older siblings and held her own in their games. One evening in October, when the first snow was dusting the mountain peaks and the air carried the promise of winter, the family gathered around the fire after supper. Wyatt was carving a new handle for a tool that had broken. The children were supposed to be doing their evening chores, and Eleanor was mending by lamplight. June appeared at Eleanor's elbow, her small face serious. "Mama, I need to tell you something." "What is it, sweetheart?" "I don't remember my first mama, the one who had me in her tummy." June's dark eyes were troubled. "Eli and Mara and Tommy, they remember their first mamas and papas, but I don't remember anyone before Ma Clara. Does that make me bad?" Eleanor set down her mending and pulled the child into her lap. "Oh, honey, no, that doesn't make you bad. You were so little when you came to this family, just a tiny baby. It's natural that you don't remember before that. But sometimes I feel sad about it, like I'm missing something important." Eleanor held her close, feeling the weight of this small person who'd come into the world unwanted and unloved and had somehow, miraculously, ended up here. "You know what I think? I think maybe your first mama loved you so much that she knew she couldn't take care of you the way you deserved. So she brought you somewhere safe, somewhere she knew you'd be found by people who could love you properly. That took courage, June. She could have made other choices, harder choices, but she chose to give you a chance at a good life." "You really think so?" "I do. And I think she'd be so proud if she could see you now, healthy and happy and loved by a whole family who'd fight dragons for you." June considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm glad she brought me here, because now I have you and Pa and Mara and Eli and Tommy. That's a lot of people to love me." "That's right. You're very rich in love, June Marie Boone." The child beamed at the use of her full legal name, the one that made her officially part of this family. She snuggled deeper into Eleanor's arms and announced, "I think I'm the luckiest girl in Wyoming." "I think," Eleanor replied, kissing the top of her head, "that we're all pretty lucky." Winter came hard and fast that year, blanketing the valley in snow by mid-November and keeping them housebound for days at a time. But the house was tight and well-provisioned, and somehow the forced closeness only strengthened their bonds. They played games and told stories, did lessons around the kitchen table, and worked on projects that would have been impossible during the busy spring and summer. Eleanor taught Mara to read music from an old hymnal she'd brought from Denver, and discovered the girl had a sweet, true voice. Tommy learned to read chapter books, devouring every story Eleanor could provide and begging for more. Eli worked with Wyatt on plans for expanding the ranch, learning to think strategically about business. And June, with the determined concentration only a young child can muster, learned to write her full name and count to 100. On Christmas Eve, they gathered around the tree Wyatt and Eli had cut from the foothills. A scrubby juniper that looked half dead, but that the children had decorated with strings of popcorn and paper chains and dried apple slices. There were no store-bought presents, but everyone had made something for each other. Eleanor received a carved wooden box from Wyatt, a drawing of the family from Mara, a collection of interesting rocks from Tommy, a scarf knitted from yarn unraveled from an old sweater from Eli, and a lopsided clay bowl from June that was the most precious thing Eleanor had ever been given. After the children were finally asleep, giddy with excitement and sugar from the cookies they'd made, Eleanor and Wyatt sat by the dying fire, holding hands and watching the play of light on the walls. "This time last year," Wyatt said quietly, "I was wondering if I'd make it to spring. Wondering if I had the strength to keep going without Clara, to keep fighting for kids who weren't even legally mine. The loneliness was eating me alive. And now? Now I have you. I have them, really and truly and legally. I have a reason to get up every morning that isn't just grim determination. He turned to face her fully. Eleanor, you saved us. All of us. This family would have fallen apart without you. We saved each other, Eleanor corrected. I was just as lost as you were, just as certain my life was over, and then I walked through that gate and you smiled and said my barrenness was good because you had enough kids for both of us. Do you remember that? How could I forget? It was the truest thing I'd ever said. Wyatt pulled her close. You want to know something? When I saw you standing there with your carpet bag and your worn dress and your eyes full of hurt, something in me recognized something in you. I thought, here's someone who understands loss. Here's someone who might understand us. You were right, Eleanor whispered. I did understand. I do understand. And I thank God every day that I had the courage to stay. They sat together until the fire burned down to ash, until the house was cold enough that they needed to retreat to their bedroom and the warmth of shared blankets. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about the long road that had brought her here, the pain and loss and desperation that had felt like the end of everything. But it hadn't been the end. It had been preparation. Every moment of grief had been teaching her how to hold space for other people's pain. Every moment of loneliness had been showing her how precious connection was. Every moment of believing she was worthless had been preparing her to see value in children the world had discarded. She'd come to this ranch believing she had nothing to offer, but she'd been wrong. She'd had everything to offer, just not in the way she'd imagined. Spring returned to Bennett Valley with its usual dramatic flair. The snow melting in rushing torrents, the grass exploding into green, the cottonwoods budding out almost overnight. The Boone family emerged from their winter hibernation like bears from a den, blinking in the sudden brightness and eager to be outside again. On a morning in late April, Eleanor stood in the yard watching the children play while Wyatt worked with a young horse in the corral. June was turning 5 next week, and the baby roundness was leaving her face, revealing the person she'd become, confident, curious, deeply loved. Mara, at 10, was on the cusp of adolescence, her body beginning to change in ways that both excited and frightened her. Tommy, 8 now, was missing both front teeth and looked like a jack-o'-lantern when he grinned. And Eli, who just celebrated his 13th birthday, was nearly as tall as Wyatt and developing the rangy strength of young manhood. They were growing up so fast, these children of hers. Soon enough, they'd be adults, making their own choices, building their own lives. The thought should have been frightening. After all, she'd only had them for a little over a year. But instead, Eleanor felt a quiet pride. She and Wyatt were giving them the tools they'd need: education, love, confidence, the knowledge that they were valued and wanted. Mrs. Henderson came riding up the valley road, her horse picking its way carefully through the mud left by the spring melt. She dismounted at the gate and hurried over to Eleanor with obvious excitement. "I have news," she announced without preamble. "The territorial legislature just passed a new law. It establishes formal protections for adopted children, says they have the same legal rights as biological children, that they can inherit property, that they can't be taken away once adoption is finalized except in cases of extreme abuse or neglect." Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief. So the children are completely safe now? No one can question their place in this family? No one, Mrs. Henderson confirmed. They're as much yours as if you'd given birth to them. The law recognizes that now, officially and permanently. That evening, Eleanor shared the news with the family. The children didn't fully understand the legal implications, but they understood the important part. They were safe. They were permanent. They were home. As summer arrived and the ranch burst into full productivity, Eleanor found herself thinking often about the journey that had brought them all to this point. She thought about this woman she'd been, broken, hopeless, convinced her life was over at 28. She thought about the children who'd been cast off by the world, labeled as unwanted or too difficult or simply inconvenient. She thought about Wyatt, trying to honor his dying wife's wishes while facing a system determined to tear his family apart. And she thought about how they'd all saved each other. Not in some grand, dramatic way, but through the steady accumulation of ordinary moments,
through breakfast made and lessons taught, and stories read and nightmares soothed, through patience and persistence, and the stubborn refusal to give up on love, even when love seemed impossible. On an evening in June, exactly 1 year after Eleanor and Wyatt had married under the cottonwood tree, the family gathered there again for a celebration. They'd invited their neighbors and friends, and the yard was full of people eating and laughing and dancing to fiddle music. At one point, Eleanor found herself standing slightly apart, watching it all with a sense of wonder. This was her life now. These were her people. This family that shouldn't exist, that had been cobbled together from loss and desperation and sheer stubborn hope, was thriving. Wyatt appeared at her side and slipped an arm around her waist. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Boone." "Happy anniversary," Eleanor replied. "Thank you for taking a chance on a barren schoolteacher with a worn carpetbag and too much grief. Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with 4 wild kids and no idea what he was doing." Wyatt pulled her close. "You know what I realized today? A year ago, I thought we were getting married to save the children, to satisfy the law and keep the family together, but that's not really why we did it." "No? No. We did it because somewhere in those first few weeks we fell in love, not with the idea of being a family, but with each other. The children were the excuse. The reason was us." He kissed her temple. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to marry me." "Second best decision," Eleanor corrected with a smile. "The best was opening your door to those 4 children in the first place." "Fair enough," Wyatt laughed. "Come on, our kids are waiting for us to cut the anniversary cake." They walked back toward the celebration together, hand in hand, and Eleanor felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. She'd spent so many years believing that her inability to bear children defined her, that it made her less than whole. But she understood now that she'd been wrong about everything. Motherhood wasn't about biology. It was about choice. It was about showing up every day and loving children who needed loving. It was about creating a home that was built on something stronger than blood, built on commitment and patience, and the stubborn belief that family was what you made it, not what you were born into. She gathered June into her arms as they approached the cake table, and the other children clustered around, Mara and Tommy on one side, Eli on the other, all of them looking at her with such love and trust it made her throat tight. "Make a wish, Mama," June demanded. "You and Pa both have to make a wish before you cut the cake." Eleanor looked at Wyatt, at their children, at the friends and neighbors who'd supported them through the hardest year of their lives. She thought about wishes and how foolish they'd always seemed to her, wanting things you couldn't have, hoping for miracles that never came. But maybe wishes weren't foolish after all. Maybe they were just prayers in disguise. Maybe every time she'd wished for a family, for children to love, for a purpose beyond just surviving, the universe had been listening. And maybe the answer had been yes all along, just not in the way she'd expected. "I don't need to wish," Eleanor said softly, pulling all her children close, feeling Wyatt's arm around her shoulders. "Everything I ever wanted is right here." And as the sun set over Bennett Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the Boone family cut their cake and danced and laughed together. They were a strange family, cobbled together from broken pieces and impossible circumstances. They were a family that shouldn't have survived according to all the laws and regulations and social expectations of their time. But they had survived. More than that, they'd thrived. Because in the end, the only law that really mattered was the law of love. And by that measure, they were the richest family in Wyoming territory. Eleanor had come to this ranch with nothing but a carpetbag and a broken heart, believing she had nothing to offer. But she'd been wrong. She'd had everything to offer. She'd had love to give and room in her heart for children who needed loving. She'd had the courage to stay when staying was hard, to fight when fighting seemed impossible, to believe in family even when family seemed like a foolish dream. And that stubborn, fierce, impossible love had been enough to build something that would last. Not just for a season or a year, but for a lifetime, for generations. As the stars began to emerge overhead and the children's laughter rang out across the valley, Eleanor held her family close and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. She was home,